Shall we in fact start? Welcome everybody back after the lunch. We're now talking about, as you'll see in your program, technology and inequalities. And we have Dr. Boitina Gyomazi to speak here today to us. If we can please have your attention. Basically, on page, whatever it is, I think it's the 4th page of the program, you more or less know what it is we're seeking to do in this session. Essentially, I think we all know that, from the earliest of times, to get economic growth, we've needed technology. And also, of course, with growth, you've got a spurt in new technologies. And the one is related to the other. But never before, as in the last 10 years and more, has technology had such a huge impact on the most remote parts of the world. The sweep and speed of events is bewildering. And almost every day we are overcome by how much technology advances. Obviously, the question that arises is that in general, technology advances the human condition. It improves in general people's lives, material, social, and other, except that now we have the climate emergency challenges. But it's always unevenly distributed. So those who are better off tend disproportionately to gain from technological advances, and reverse, those who are disempowered end up being disproportionately worse off. Though overall, as we saw this morning in other forums, global poverty has been reduced. Within each country, the inequalities have become worse. And if technology is going where it seems to be going, it's entirely possible that those who are digitally empowered will become even more empowered, and those who are digitally excluded will become yet more excluded, leading to circumstances that provide for social explosion. So this is mainly the theme that Dr. Gyomazi is going to deal with today. How is it that we can ensure that the technology that is emerging and is sweeping our globe advances the interests of all and in fact reduces the inequalities that we so desperately need to? She is the director of the Digital Development Department of the Infrastructure Practice Group, I learned, of the World Bank. She heads a global team working on building digital economies in developing countries. She also leads the Digital Development Partnership Program, a multi-donor trust fund focusing on digital development globally. Before she joined the World Bank, she was an assistant professor at the university in Tunis, and she was also had a spell at the International Telecommunications Union. She holds a PhD in telecommunications law and policy at McGill at Canada. There was meant to be a discussant, but she was so intimidated, whoever it was, or he, by Dr. Gyomazi, but he or she is not here. I'm told by the organizers that, politicians love this, right? I'm serving both as a moderator and a discussant. But you can give me a round of applause. I shall not be taking the full 30 minutes I'm allocated. I'm not the main speaker here. If and as and when, hopefully not, I'm asked to be a discussant, I will. But hey, if you all participate fully, then my job becomes easier. And both you and I will be less bored. I get bored listening to myself. So really, I'd rather you speak than me. Thank you very much. Over to you, madam.
Thank you so much.
There we are.
Okay. Very good.
Good.
Thank you
Not
so
a very
much.
good start for somebody.
On the discussion about technology, the first thing that technology should help doesn't work.
Even worse,
So thank you so much for the invitation to talk to you today about technology and inequality. This is a topic that is very, very important. And it's a complex relationship that exists between technology and inequality. It's a multifaceted relationship.
You got 10 minutes, right? So I'll monitor.
Yes. It's a multifaceted relationship, and there is tension going on opposite directions, and the tension exists at the same time. On the one side, digital technology can be an excellent equalizer. Technology can give voice to those who don't. It's an empowerment tool. It's a tool of inclusion. This is the promises of technology that we know technology can deliver. But at the other hand, if the tools for technology are not equally distributed, technology can create deeper inequalities. So what we'll try to do in this presentation is try to see what are the promises, and then try to understand a little bit more the different layers of the digital divide that exists today. And we'll end up with some discussion about what can we do as policymakers, as private sector, as the different parts of the digital ecosystem to move the needle, moving from the divide to actual dividends. So these are the promises of economic transformation. And we know that the digital part of the economy is the part that is moving much faster than the traditional part of the economy. Today, it is estimated at about 15% of global GDP. In less than a decade, it will be 25%. So the promises of digital for development, this is something that we studied during the WDR, called Digital Dividends in 2016, that looks at how digital can help development. And it does through making information more readily available, helping with inclusion. It helps by making automation and coordination, which helps with efficiency, and it creates economies of scale and platforms, which helps with innovation. And these three elements happen at three levels of economic agents. So the individual at an individual level, government, and also the enterprises. What is important about digital transformation, it's not a sector in its own right. Well, it remains a very important part of the economy. Its importance is by the fact that it touches every sector of the economy. There is hardly any sector today that digital transformation cannot transform deeply. From energy to agriculture to education, we just name it. For example, I take digital transport with smart transport, with mobility as a service. Transport today is as about bits and bytes as it is about roads and cars. So this is the promises of technology. I mentioned in the beginning it's an equalizer, and we can take a few examples of how technology can give voice in several sectors. Education with access to the right technology with the right bandwidth. People can have access to the same content through e-learning and through MOOCs. That's very powerful, right? We take the example of financial services. The example of Kenya keeps coming up as a very good example where using technology there is now financial inclusion, which was not possible through the traditional banking, physical banking. Digital identification is another example. With digital ID, we know that a big part of our life now moved to the cyberspace. So if we don't have a digital ID, people cannot participate in all the activities that are digital in nature. So it gives voice, it helps with inclusion, at least that's the promise. And we can look at it also with the linkages with the SDGs. There is a lot of discussion that if we put enough emphasis on digital, there is a possibility that we can reach some SDGs faster than not having a digital component. Here are a few examples. SDG 1 and SDG 2, for example, East Africa, there are activities that allow smallholder farmers to sell their products directly to wholesalers, cutting the middlemen. It helps with, ending poverty. The other example on women empowerment, we have here an example in South Africa where the use of digital cards for government safety nets transfer really enhanced the women's decision-making power with a possibility of 92% increase in women's likelihood of working. So these are very good examples of how digital can be an equalizer and how digital can help with inclusion and help with development. But it's not that rosy, unfortunately. I mean, the picture is not that rosy because there are today persistent digital divides that create deeper inequalities. And what I'll try to do is to talk about these different layers of divides. The first one is the global digital divide. It's the divide between countries. This year was a year of celebration that we reached 50% of the total population now is connected to the internet. There is a reason to be proud of this, but it's also very scary because it took us 50 years to get to this milestone. Then the question is it going to take us another 50 years to bring the rest of the world, the rest of the 50% online? And this chart shows, if we look at the least developing countries, this is where the problem is, bigger. It's only 1 in 5 people today that are online. If we look at a regional cut of this, Africa, 25% of people are connected to the internet, only 25%. And we can look deeper. Within the 25%, only 8% have access to 4G quality. So 25%, but mostly 3G, in a time where we're moving to 4G and 5G. So there is a clear access debate there and divide. And we can think about it like, we're going on a highway. So there are a few fast lanes, and you'll see that the fast lanes have few cars. And the lane that is small or slow has more cars. And there is another lane that we didn't put, the super slow lane. So there is a clear divide at the global level between those who have the tools to reach the promise of digital transformation and those who are still working on it. In addition to the divide between countries, there is a big divide within countries. So the geographic divide, and it's mostly the unconnected, are mostly the rural population. In middle-income countries, 40% of the rural population are less likely to use mobile internet than urban population. And there could be many reasons for that. In many cases, rural population, there is not enough density to justify investment from private sector perspective. So we see that it's much easier to connect people in urban areas than in rural areas. But, it creates this divide between the haves and have-nots. And it creates actually, a new class of poor, the digital poor within any particular country. The chart here shows in the case of Africa, in 2019, it is 58%. There is an advance over last year. It was 65%, so there is development, but the divide is there and it's a source of concern. In addition to the geographic divide, there is an income divide. I mean, today, those who can pay for it can use it, and those who don't pay for it are basically, watching on the sidelines. The 2% mark is a decision that many, basically ITU and the Alliance for Affordable Internet defined what does it mean to have affordable internet. It shouldn't cost more than 2% of monthly GDP per capita. The situation, as we see, like a big percentage of people living in the world today are not able to afford the internet. It's not only about, okay, thank you. I got a gift.
Yes, before anybody squeals, I am merely acting on behalf of my bosses here. They're saying that she can speak for 15 minutes. Okay. Of course, I will remember that, Gergana, next time I'm here, and you allocated me 7 minutes, okay? I won't forget this, right? You go ahead.
Very good. So in terms of the income, there is also the whole issue about the affordability of handsets. The whole sector is beyond voice. Voice is the past. To be really able to participate in the digital economy, we need to have the handsets that allows us to use the internet. So we're talking about smartphones. Smartphones are expensive. Here we looked at, in Africa, for example, it costs 375% of the monthly income. So the divide is there, and it's really scary. And this is my favorite topic, the gender divide. We always talk that, tech has no gender. Unfortunately, it is really unbalanced. There is a big gender divide today in terms of access to the internet, in terms of the ability of women to use digital as a source of empowerment. Globally, women are 12% less likely than men to have internet access, 25% less likely than men to know how to leverage digital technology for basic services. And if we look between the regions, I mean, in South Asia, 70%, the gender digital gap is 70%, followed by Africa, 34%. There are examples of 4%. I mean, this is an agenda that requires a lot of stamina. Hopefully, one day, I will show you another map. I will need more than 15 minutes at that time, where it's 0%.
You're a favorite here, so I don't see a problem.
And then it's not only about access. I mean, there is a big issue about skills. Once you have access to the internet, to the broadband connectivity, what do we do with this? And this is where it's very important to have the skills dimension in the middle. Today, unfortunately, there is a big skills gap. And we can look at it in 3 levels, from basic skills to standard skills to advanced skills. And we look at it between regions. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that people are equipped to use the technology, but not only to consume it. I think for policymakers and for governments, it's very important that they put in place programs where their citizens are not only consumers of technology, but they can also produce it and they can use it as a competition tool. When we look at the skills agenda, it gets a little bit more complicated because with the future of work and with automation, there will be a point where jobs that are low skilled will disappear. This will create another divide between those who have jobs and those who left their jobs because of technology, which creates what you mentioned earlier, the social tension that could exist. So important to look at this also when we talk about the inequality. So far we spoke about the divide linked to people. There is also another dimension that we need to take into account, and that is there an equivalent space out there for firms to compete in this digital economy? And digital economy and the economy that is based on technology is creating platforms, which are very important. But within the platforms approach, there is a possibility for those who cannot compete, especially if there is poor competition policy framework, that they don't have space in this scheme of things. So as we think about the equality, it's not only people, but also do our firms in our countries have what it takes to compete in this space that is increasingly dominated by the big players. As we think about the digital divide, and what makes inequality linked to technology, there is a very important element that we need to take into account, that the discussion cannot take place thinking that it's a static discussion. And that's what makes it very complicated. Technology today can create inequality. We can fix them today, but as we fix them, we need to anticipate the future. And the future is one of huge connectivity that is smart connectivity. It's not enough today to talk about internet to the people. We're talking about Internet of Things. We live and we're constantly going to a space where everything is becoming smart. Everything is talking to everything. So in this space of 5G connectivity, where everything has an application, a sensor that creates data that we need to analyze, are we equipped to be facing this global economy, a global economy that is really data-driven? And for countries who do not have what it takes to understand the type of data that it is created, to know how to protect it, to know how to monetize it, and to know how to use it, then we have an even deeper sense of inequality. So, what do we do? How do we move from these multi-layer, complex divide situation to a situation where we go back to the first slide and we saw that technology actually can be an equalizer? So what I propose here is basically 3 things. I think we need to focus a lot on policy, we need to focus on investment, and we need to focus on people. And as we do these 3 things, we need to think about them in an ecosystem approach that is holistic in manner. So this is something that, in the bank, we've been thinking a lot about digital development, and we came to a conclusion that we cannot talk about it just as from the supply side of it. We need to think about it in an ecosystem approach where infrastructure is very important, but also skills and also payment system. If we think about this in this ecosystem approach, then we're more likely able to make a difference linked to the sector. I think in terms of policy, policy runs through all the foundational elements of digital economy. What I chose here is just to talk about policies related to improving access. And here we think about the policies that create good competition between the different players, access to landing station that is open, making sure that there is a good spectrum environment. 5G is all about spectrum. Spectrum needs to be available and needs to be accessible. And what I have in the other side is the example of mobile communication, where each layer or each generation required policy consideration that is different from the older generation. The key thing about policy and regulation, they need to be agile, as we are moving to a system where it's not about voice anymore, it's about data. And we need to have the possibility to adapt and update the policy and regulations as we go. It requires investment, it requires money. So I will not go into the details, but this is something that we're going to launch on Thursday. This is a report that we did with the Broadband Commission that looks at how much it would take to take the whole continent of Africa fully connected at 90% to population of 10 years and older. And it requires a lot of investment. It doesn't mean that all the money has to come from government. It means that the private sector and the government need to work hand in hand to make sure that there is this full connectivity. And as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, it's all about people. Technology in its own self is not important. It's all about people. So we need to empower people through policies to help them take advantage of this power that is changing the world and changing the whole economic landscape. To conclude, digital technology can amplify existing macro trends in society, including the rising inequalities, but it can also promote inclusion if we give ourselves the means to achieve a human-centered digital transformation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. As members of Parliament, our main preoccupation is what can we do to ensure that this works for the interests primarily, if all the people in the country that we come from, primarily for the poor and disadvantaged. What is it as MPs we should be doing is a key theme. You're free to say whatever you want, but if you can slide in things that you think as MPs we can do. Okay. Over to members who want to contribute. I'll take you and I'll number you, as it were. 1, 2. So on this side there's 2, and then there's 3, 4. As we go down, 5, 6, and then behind there's 7. Look, we have plenty of time from what I can gather, right? We have an hour and 15 minutes. So there's 7 for now. If you can please stick to about 2 minutes each, please. And I'll time you. Is that okay? Now remember, when this thing erupts, it's not me, it's Apple, okay? You have a problem with not me. So here we go for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Karim, you said that what MPs can do about all this stuff. To me, it appears that laws relating to intellectual properties, usually prevalent in the developed countries, stand on the way of easy transfer of technology from the developed to the developing. Are we going to do something about this through the institutions that we have, or by raising the voices in various parliaments? Thank
you. Oui, merci. Pense qu'aujourd'hui,
Thank you. I believe today the digital is crucial. Everybody knows it. However, what I would like to talk about is adapting it to our situation within our countries. We have a true problem when it comes to collecting data. Can we draft development policy and monitoring of projects and programs on the ground? We need data. How can the digital technology can help us to draft adequate development policy? Thank you.
Again?
Thank you for both your presentations. I think that, first of all, when it comes to laws and regulations, what I think history has shown us is laws can never keep up. And that's a basic fact. And so I think we need to evolve to a framework where we have a basic law, and we need to leave it up to regulations within technical teams. And then the Parliament should play a role of oversight of those regulations, making sure that they're ahead of the game. Another issue that was not discussed that I think is of critical importance is of artificial intelligence and other tools that are evolving towards changing we do business in every field, including in management and governance. And the truth is, what we are seeing is, particularly in less capable environments, the capability to audit the way those artificial intelligence algorithms are leading to decision making is very, very biased in a way, and many settings are not capable to respond accordingly. And so I would ask if there's been discussions around that. Another issue is on data. Considering personal data belonging to each of us, and Europe has tried to evolve on this issue, the truth is there's a tremendous amount of money in data. The monetization of data, making sure that we can get those dividends back to the citizens. Are there tools being studied? I know there's a lot of technology like blockchain looking into this. What can be done? And lastly, a comment / question. How do you see, we hear about the digital divide, but can't digital also be an opportunity for many of those low and middle income countries to leapfrog from the lessons that we've learned from digital implementation in the more developed countries around the world? Thank you.
Right here. Thank you. What we can do as MPs, I think 2 points. One, we need to build confidence and trust so that people actually believe that these systems make their lives better. And that, I think, is pretty universal, regardless of a country where you come from. And the second point is, I think it helps a lot if we don't pass the laws which prevent innovation. Just let the innovation to thrive, and things will develop. Now, coming from Estonia, a small digital nation, for us, building or developing the ecosystem has been a journey. And those of you who are maybe a bit hesitant when to start, I think it's a huge advantage once you start that you don't have legacy systems. So you actually can make advantage of what is the best available technology today and build on it. Once you have legacy systems, it is much more difficult to stay on top. Thank you.
Je veux commencer par un petit...
I will start with an example. We were in Madagascar with new parliamentarians, and we met with the president who told us that everything digital is dangerous because as he saw it, it meant Facebook and WhatsApp with everything that comes with it as a vector of intolerance or criticism that are launched against the management of a country. We saw here that you showed that Africa is really lagging behind, and we should use digital to fight against inequalities. With this concept, as parliamentarians, how do you think that we could work so as to have good laws that political authorities might understand that internet and digital is really the ally of development? Each time that we have demonstrations and problems, internet is being cut off. But when you do so, you penalize students that are going to school, for instance, and everything else? Thank you.
It's 7? Okay, thanks. I think there are a number of things, but one thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that technology is ahead of governments. Technology is ahead of governments, and technology is replacing virtually everything. And I think the only human being that the technology is not replacing at the moment is the woman. It has also managed to replace a man. So I think there are many things that are happening, and and based on that, in terms of what members of parliament really need to do is all of these innovations and whatever they are have sources. I think this is a time that governments need to network beyond the way they network under Interpol, for example, in terms of Interpol police or Interpol policing. I think this is the time that governments really need to work, because where these things come from, individuals are domiciled in some countries. And from wherever that is, however small that is, whether it is Safaricom in Kenya doing M-Pesa and whatever it is, I think that really needs to be known, and the governments need to share that out as much as possible, even before they come up with their own regulations and legislations.
All right, 8, and then we'll have a second round. So number 8, the gentleman in front here.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. It's such an important topic, and I just to the point about audit standards around artificial intelligence algorithms. Canada has actually established the first audit framework of any government in the world to have that in place. It's a very important initiative. And it's amazing the biases that exist and the damage that can be done if it's not in place. So I thought I'd point that out, and that's something that those who are interested in the topic can look to. For me, I'm interested in the potential abuses of privacy and digital identity, especially when you look at the potential of something, for example, like Libra, that has been proposed by Facebook. To have a fiat-backed crypto asset that is tied to a social and communication network. The amount of information that one organization can have, especially in fragile democracies, one organization could have on the residents of that democracy, fragile democracy, and the potential abuses of that, and the speed at which a crypto asset, cryptocurrency, could take over the local currency and leave a country with no ability to manage its own monetary policy because they've lost control of their currency entirely. So I think the point that was just made by my colleague from Kenya behind me about agile regulation and us working together as nations, developed and developing nations, around some of these major issues that technology is moving so rapidly and introducing a number of risks that are at the same time opportunities. But it is up to parliamentarians, and we need to help one another in order to make sure that these risks become opportunities. So I just want to reinforce that point. Thank you.
We will have a second round, but I can't resist this. Remember, I'm a discussant come moderator. The first question I wanted to ask was, maybe it's unfair to ask it, but what is ultimately the point of technology if it doesn't advance human development as a whole? Meaning, there's something almost inevitable that it should reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. Otherwise, what is the point of it? To make the rich richer and the poor poorer. Secondly, would it be possible to suggest, look, technology is not good or bad, it's how it's wielded. So you cannot separate all the advances in robotics and artificial intelligence and big data and the Internet of Things from those who are the power wielders, those who determine the regulatory systems and the laws within which the private sector is able to do this. So, it's basically, the way I put it in a subtext, I like your comment, unless we have a more humane social system, you're not going to reduce the gaps. people will wield technology to advance their own narrow material interests and sometimes ideological ones. Thirdly, it strikes me as I listen to others, isn't there something a bit bizarre, almost surrealistic, that here you are talking about all the wonders of technology, and at the same time, we're talking globally, well, not we, whoever they are, and we all know who we are, we're right here in the middle of it, of protectionism and trade wars and so on. I mean, this technology that you're talking about has no recognition of boundaries. And yet, on the other hand, where are we today, right, as we've heard since this morning? And finally, how is it ever going to be possible, given the global inequalities we have, but more social media and what have you, which is a crucial aspect of technology, people are able in the most remotest part of the most remotest rural area on my continent, I'm from South Africa, not be aware that others elsewhere in the world live a life that maybe they spend 20 times a day more than these people do. So how are you going to stop migration? In a way, social media, which is part of the technology you speak of, impels people to look for the best that they can get, irrespective of artificial boundaries. Thank you.
So, great questions. I think, and there are a few elements that come back in different manners. I think what I heard from the question is, one, is at the end of the day, maybe I'll start with you. I think the point that we need to drive at consistently is that technology is not an objective in its own right. It's not about technology. And, whoever, and especially you around the table, can bring this message close home. I think it's very important. Technology is a tool. Today we're talking about digital, tomorrow it's going to be something else. We cannot anticipate what tomorrow will bring. So going back to the basics, I think it's very important. It's about people. Technology can make life of people much easier. Technology is, getting the world to become this global village. Distance doesn't matter when there is technology. We're all, citizens of a world that we can watch real time. And with 5G, it's really going to be real time. So there is a transformation ability of technology that, if it's put on the right framework, that it's a tool to an end, and putting the human dimension central to the discussion, I think it is very important. The other point that I heard is, what is the role of regulation and policy making within a sector that evolves very, very fast. And I heard it from several of the colleagues around the table. Governments and policymakers are constantly trying to raise technology, but they will constantly fail because technology is moving very, very fast. So this will get us to a point where thinking about the basics, thinking about the fundamental elements of regulation is very important. And don't regulate to kill innovation, definitely. We see tendency in many countries of over-regulating and using also, the methodology, the terminology of a sector that is totally different from what we're trying to regulate today. And most of the regulation today is about a word that was dominated by voice. Today, it is not voice, it is data. And in many cases, what we see is using, the old approaches of thinking about technology in the traditional sense would kill innovation. So I think, you have definitely a very important role to get to a mindset shift that is needed. Regulate when it's needed, to the extent that is needed. Don't kill innovation, because, innovation is what will help us get to those, dividends that we spoke about. There was a discussion or a question about artificial intelligence and data. And when we talk about the infrastructure of the 21st century, network is very important, but it's beyond network. It's data and it's artificial intelligence. And, the connectivity we live in today is called intelligent connectivity. It is intelligent because it's everywhere, and because we can use AI to make sense of this. But if the algorithms have a bias, then we'll get definitely to a different outcome. So, I don't think we have answers. I think it's a mindset shift that needs to change. It's understanding that things are moving, and it's understanding that we need to have this approach where we create the space for innovation. We don't kill it before it's created, and we understand at the end of the day that it is very important to protect the human values. It is very important to have a system that protects data. Privacy is key. When we talk about digital economy, we talk about the promise, but we don't talk about the risks. There is a problem there. We need to understand the risk, and the risks are linked to risks of exclusion. We've been talking about it today. There are risks about, abuse of personal data, and the whole risk about cybersecurity. So, thinking about the advantages of technology without also addressing the risks would be a problem. But my point, we try to say this to our clients in our policy dialogue, is, think about the risks. Have policy and regulatory framework that help you address the risk. But don't let the fear of risks, prevent you from seeing the advantage of what technology can offer. There was a question about talking about the success stories and sharing the examples of the success stories. I think this is great, and if there are platforms like this where, good cross-fertilization of experience can exist, I think this is very important. We don't do enough of this. In the bank, we try to share the experiences as much as we can. I think it's more powerful when it comes from representatives from countries with representatives from countries. And we share the success stories, very important. We also need to dare to share the failures, because we learn more from the failures than from the success stories. There was a point about leapfrogging. I think it's an excellent point. Countries who start without legacy systems can leapfrog to the next solution. What we did when we started working about digital economy in the context of Africa, the way we think about it in the bank is really a leapfrogging opportunity. There's a continent the innovation that exists in Africa is amazing. We just mentioned the M-Pesa example. Many countries in the world are asking, what was the success story of M-Pesa? So a continent full of youth, full of good ideas, thinking of using technology to leapfrog instead of going, the traditional each phase. That's some of the promises of this technology. There are risks for sure, but if we understand the risks, try to address them, but move on with the agenda, I think there will be a lot of advantages to this global village that we all belong to. I think I answered most of the questions.
It's the second round of questions. Yes, there's somebody behind there from Kenya. One. Who's next? Number 2 there at the far end. Anybody else? 2 for now, right? Go for it. You have up to 20 minutes each. Oh, Uganda, 3. All right, now you're reduced to 2 minutes each. Where are we? 3. Uganda's a spoiler. Nobody else. Oh, you're being very provocative. Ask Naya. Once you open the door to me, they don't know me, Naya. All right, 3 of you in the order that you put your hand up. Obviously.
All right. I want to address an issue which has been emerging on technology. Technology, as much as it is helping in terms of simplifying the way business are done, it can be seen also to the redistributing business opportunities to those who have advantage of advancement in technology and those who do not. Why do I say this? It is actually coming up with what is currently being referred to as a digital market, where most of the businesses in the world will be moving from the physical contact with between the customers and the suppliers of goods and services, and then they meet in the digital place. What will happen is that it will likely redistribute the taxation from one country to the other, because it can be very difficult to monitor who benefits from technology when it comes to a digital marketplace, to the extent that countries, if they don't embrace technology, then they might find themselves that their taxation base reduces. So my question is there some effort being done by World Bank to build capacity to ensure that no one is left behind in terms of embracing technology, so that it does not promote inequities in terms of taxation and therefore reduces the revenue base for countries who do not move fast?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I absolutely agree with what you said, and actually we've been talking about this during the lunchtime, that it's important to share not just the success stories but the failure stories as well, because especially with the technology which is advancing so quickly, it's important to know where we made mistakes for others to learn from these mistakes as well. The figures that you showed during your presentation, some of them, it's not just interesting, it's a bit scary as well. And it's all happens all the time when we talk about the technologies. My question is there any prediction? I mean, what can we expect, let's say 5 years later? Because going with that speed, each of us can think about different results at the end, let's say 5 years, 10 years time, but still it would be interesting to know if there's any prediction, if there any expectation where we will be in a short period of time if we continue with this speed. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My concern is on two issues. Number one is the syllabus in education. Because if you compare what is in the syllabus of the third world countries and then what is in the other countries, you realize that the technology development that is going forward will leave behind those in the old syllabus, whereby, they will not understand what is taking place in this kind of, digital technology. So the most important thing is how can we harmonize our syllabus so that in a situations where things are moving forward in the Western world, the other side also people understand, because the syllabus is almost the same. Secondly, we're talking about the laws. I just remember last month, our Minister of Finance was talking about the cryptocurrency and say we don't have the law. We cannot operate it in our country. So the most important thing will be to harmonize the laws, so that we are at the same level, and that will minimize the inequality in that area. Thank you.
Is anybody else wants to raise any questions? Yes, of course. For number 4. I think for recording purposes, they need for you to speak into the mic.
We are using the word technology far too all-encompassing. There's a difference between the digital technology about we talked and say nuclear technology. Nuclear technology, there can be international agreements implementable of nuclear disarmament. About digital technology, there is no chance that all countries can have something equivalent of nuclear disarmament. So the damage that digital technology can do is much more than even the nuclear technology can do. And digital technology automatically democratizes the access to it without having ownership to it. And nuclear technology does not have that kind of access to all kinds of people. And therefore, democratization of access of digital technology is not actually going to be helpful. It is going to be catastrophic. And this aspect of technology, digital technology, is destructive and disruptive nature needs to be underlined.
To you for now.
Thank you. So let me start with the idea of harmonization. I think, I mean, it can have different levels. There could be some global levels of harmonized principles, and we saw some of them. For example, many countries agreed on, principles of good ID. And, they approve it and we work on it. There is also are there good principles of data and data protection? So, the international community can work towards, harmonizing. It will not go to the point of having a treaty on. I don't see it as something happening soon, but it could. But if different countries with shared interest, can sit around the table and agree on principles and harmonized principle, I think that would help. It is easier in a context of regional collaboration, and this is something that the bank is trying to work with many countries about, harmonizing regulation on telecom, for example, or harmonizing approach on how we deal with the cybersecurity within this concept of single digital market at a regional level. And so in Africa, we're working with ECOWAS, we're working with AAC. There are other also activities at other regional level, and it could lead down the road to more collaboration among regional blocks. There was a point about education, and I also want to emphasize it very much. I agree with your point. I mean, a kid going to school today, when they're out of school in 22 years, assuming that he doesn't have to repeat a year or two, they will go to a job market that is totally different from today. So and there is definitely a strong need for policymakers in the education sector and the ministers of technologies or ICT to work together to update or to include at least elements in the education system that would help this kid when he or she gets out of school to be able to work with these elements. We've seen it in many countries, and I'm sure we have good examples here around the room where coding is being introduced, for example, in elementary school. So a kid today, I mean, they're we call them the digital natives. We all know that our kids are more equipped with dealing with those gadgets than we are, and it's in their DNA, right? So how do we also work within the education system to make sure that we don't spend 10 or 15 or 20 years just to go out to a job market that requires more technology in how we learn. So part of I think getting to make a difference is also a stronger collaboration that needs to happen within each country between different ministries, and sometimes it's not happening. There was the example of taxation. I mean, this is a stronger collaboration that will be needed between the ministers of telecom and ICT and technology and the ministers of finance, because there is a big taxation element there, and sometimes it's not really clear of a common narrative is not always there. How will the future look like? No idea. We know that at least 25% of GDP will be based on digital. Somebody did the math. We're trusting this, but in terms how it will impact our life, it's nobody knows. I was in Korea 2 weeks ago, and we visited innovation center in Korea about 5G and artificial intelligence, and it was amazing. It's not Alexa, it's Hi Genie, and we basically live a different life. So we don't know how it will look like, but definitely it will be very different from the life we know today. I think that's it.
Oh, I will come back. Yes, sir. Anybody else wants to come in? Can we try maybe to focus a bit more on what as MPs we can and should do in our parliaments and in our other parliamentary work? 3, preferably if you can focus on that. But go ahead. There's 3 of you, and then we should draw to a close shortly.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, I come from a country that is supposed to have internet everywhere, but it's definitely not the case. You go in a lot of places where you have dark hole and you don't get internet. You mentioned, as it's more a remark than you mentioned you were in Korea months ago. You didn't specify which one, but I was in the other one last week. I can tell you it was the other one because I spent a complete week without internet, email, cell phone, and just before reaching Pyongyang, I was in Beijing, and in Beijing you do not have Facebook, you do not have access to a lot of services you can get in other places. So when you arrive from Paris to Beijing, you felt like you're tied up. When you arrive to Beijing after Pyongyang, it's paradise. So it's all a question of experience and what you've lived. The question, they do have intranet in Pyongyang. I visited some schools, I visited some companies, I visited a few places. They do have some kind of internet. It's their internet. The question is, what can we do as MPs? I don't know. I can vote and ask as a member of parliament that we do extend our 5Gs. We are still at 4 and looking into 5. We can push for new technology, for more access to this new technology. But when the system and when the country is scared for any reason about this access to new technology, I don't know how the World Bank or anybody else, I'm not even sure they have the flag of North Korea here. So the question is, of course, it's an extreme, and I was there last week, so it's just kind of still vibrant for me as an experience. But it's how do we provide access to those people? They don't know. They don't know what's internet.
2, and then
Yes.
number 3.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, I was listening to everything, and in my life as an academic and a scientist researcher, I was very well placed to know the advantages of communicated with remote areas and teach and transfer technology. But your graph of this system where there is different speeds and that we are going at different speeds took me thinking that the places where it is more needed, it's going very slow. And the places where there is less needed, it's going maybe too fast. Because what we are seeing also in parallel in these places where high speed and things are happening instantaneously is that it's rendering young people and everybody very sedentary. So it's bringing people with some even health problems. No? So when we come back to the question of what we can do as MPs, or I'm a senator, is to maybe put emphasis in priorities and put the money where the priority is. Because you know, I can see very well how we should put money into artificial intelligence and into robotics to perform a very difficult surgery in the Arctic, because there is no enough doctors there, or in rural areas, in remote areas. But I don't think why we should be putting money or trying to, you know, go ahead of technology where there are these companies producing things that I want to say it, we don't need it. We don't need it. You know, like I'm thinking, for example, there is a new telephone that has 4 cameras or 3 cameras, and you know, I say, okay, what's the point? But in the past, because in the past we used to have these stages where we tested a product, where we did a need analysis, where we need a risk analysis, and I know it means a lot of burden on the companies, but maybe then governments can set up priorities, incentives, and budget allocations for what is technology to be good for human being. Thank you.
be the same age because I also thought it's utterly bizarre. I think it's a Samsung phone that's now got four cameras. For what? Anyway, yeah.
Merci. Alors,
Thank you. First and foremost, the telecommunications sectors are perceived as sectors that have to bring money, inject money into the coffers of the state. Now, in my intervention, I mean, the telecommunications sector is just like roads. When you build roads, you allow other sectors, other economic sectors, to grow, to develop. And the trend we're witnessing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance, is to say that the more you tax the operators, because on the surface you're talking about services that produce a lot of money, of course, because everybody uses their products on a daily basis, but in reality this fiscal pressure on operators is a pressure on a sector that is in constant evolution and mutation. So as representatives, as parliamentarians, we need to understand better the permanent evolution of the technological sector, first and foremost, not hamper it too much and not goad it along too much, not spur it along too much, and understand it. Now, the second dimension in this is education. You mentioned capabilities. Today, it is possible to massively invest in telecommunications without having to go through traditional training circuits. But for this, to do so, perhaps you could suggest some sort of law, legislation that would make it possible to guarantee this kind of access, because in schools in Africa, I'm not sure at what age children can have computers and at what age they can start having iPads in African schools.
Meditation role, because we're about to draw to a close. Firstly, my own sense, I'd like to hear what you have to say. I could be completely wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, is that while this technology will benefit people as a whole, I think it's going to benefit in the developing world, mostly elites. And so I think the gap between those of us who are well off, relatively speaking, in the developing world and those who are the underclass is going to increase, I fear. And that's going to exaggerate the issues of world poverty, if anything. The other thing that strikes me is we got robots now and artificial intelligence, and every second you're hearing about we're leaping ahead every second. If that's the case, why can't you deal with climate emergency? I mean, what is the point of all this growth in science and technology if we can't deal with the biggest perennial problem we have globally? It seems to me that, this is yet another side of struggle for us as MPs. Those of us, and I'm sure almost all of us here, are committed to reducing inequalities. This has become now, as I listen to you and others, an important side of struggle, because I think it's going to increase inequalities. Although as a whole, it'll benefit us globally. And some of the things we can think about, and some of the things that have already been said, is that I think our parliament should have some sort of overall green or white paper with some policy framework shaped by our own conditions, but taking into account what's happening elsewhere. We need a sort of like a fourth industrial revolution paper or strategic framework in the first instance that guides what we do. It should have immediate, medium-term, and long-term goals. Secondly, I think we might need to have some legislation that flows from that. Thirdly, are the tax issues that are raised. Fourthly, and around the tax issues, we should also look at illicit financial flows. Our continent, Africa, over 50 to 80 billion a year disappears from our continent to the developed world, far more than we get in aid, as the Mbeki Commission found about 5 years ago. The next thing is on education. It's been covered. Now, in our country, South Africa, we tried to produce very basic pads, like iPads, but very simple ones, to children. We targeted the rural areas in the main because it's harder to get school textbooks to them. It hasn't worked because the cost of data is so high. Now, in the developing world, data costs in general much higher. Certainly in my country, the costs of data, and we're a middle-level income developing country, is 14 times higher than the global average. That's because we haven't released spectrum. How many of us here on our continent, Africa, have converted from analog to digital migration? We're still watching TV on analog TVs, and so we haven't released the spectrum that's necessary to actually reduce the costs of data and to have more spectrum available for broadband. Look at the speeds of broadband in our country, and take Estonia. There's a colleague here from Estonia. So those issues have to be looked at. I think in Parliament we should set up joint parliamentary committees, including the Economic Development Committee, the Finance Committee, the Communications Committee, and so on, and focus on this issue. Another thing we could look at is also the whole education system has been raised already. The reskilling of jobs in the union movement. That's a big issue in South Africa. Many jobs are being lost. The trade union movement is up in arms. They accept for growth you need to be digitalized, but at the same time you're losing jobs. So that's a big issue. You've got to carry NGOs with you in that regard, and so on and so on. So there are many things we can do. And it's the rural areas, once again, that suffer the most. Yet, it seems to me, you the expert, ICT and technology that you speak of should benefit the rural areas disproportionately more. Then the states we're in have to become far more efficient than we are. And you know, all I'm saying in short is, while there's all this wondrous and wonderful potential for human growth, I think at this stage, given what's going on and the balance of forces, it's going to exacerbate the inequalities between the haves and the have-nots. Your comments, please.
I think this is why it's very important to have deliberate policies. Yes. And good laws and good regulations to address this problem. And I heard elements of an answer already from colleagues around the table in the prioritization. The private sector will go ahead. They will create the foldable ones. They will create the phones with five cameras, and there is a market for that. But I think where the role of the government should be very, very clear is using public resources where the private sector is not willing to go. Some of them could go to the rural areas, but in many cases, the reason why rural areas are not connected because the math doesn't add up. So then that's the role for subsidies, that's the role for government intervention, that's the role for using public resources where the priorities are the clearest. And I think it really is a very important role that government should play. So government are an anchor for using technology for good, good uses. And we heard the case from Estonia, fully digital government. I mean, the e-government application in Estonia are amazing. Including voting and including, so the governments can play the role of an anchor using technology, and also thinking about how do we reach those that the market doesn't reach. And if we prioritize this with the right investment, with the right laws, with the right regulation, we might be in a situation of at least they're not so far behind, because if we just leave it without the guidance of a policy making and your role, there will be this risk that we talked about in the beginning. It will make those who are powerful more powerful. So there is a kind of I don't know what the right word for it, but positive discrimination that needs to happen in those areas where it's not and it hasn't happened automatically. And time is of essence. Today technology, whether we like it or not, it's defining the comparative advantage of nations. It is a global world. If you have access to this technology, then your firms are better. Your people are more informed. Your government is more efficient. It's really defining, how we race towards development. So sometimes it's very needed to be very, very deliberate about the policies, the regulations, and the investment that should only go where there is priorities.
Thank you very much. I would like to draw your attention to a very important factor, the African people living in the diaspora. Are you hearing? If I take the example of my country, Senegal, I have 1/3 of my population in the diaspora. In this diaspora, we have children. They're going to school. They have easy access at early stage to the new technology. Recently, I was in Paris. In my hotel, I received a visit of my grandson. He had just 3 years old. But he was crying, and I asked his father, why he's crying? He said, because when he received the link, you know, those, you know, the loading process, he was too slow for him. And he was crying for that. You see, at that he's 3 years old, at that early stage, you know, he's so addicted to new technology, he even haven't got enough patience to do so. But this is going to create a necessity, this external, that positive externality. He's going to create a situation in the country of origin. They have their parents, they have their relative, they need to contact them and to communicate with them daily, hourly, and this is going to create another situation independently of the policy of the government itself. Within the family itself, you have a new situation. And if you read the last Africa Pulses published by the World Bank in the 6-monthly publication of the World Bank on the situation, economic situation in Africa, there this last chapter is dealing with new technology. And you have a tremendous perspective in this regard. That's why I don't agree with my sister saying that we don't need 6 cameras, etc. We need every single thing. We need everything. Because the situation is such that we have to take stock of what's going on in the field. And we cannot expect the government to do it because the government, they are not aware of the rapid changes on the field. That's why I really like the proposal you are making, the presentation you are making, that open an immensely rich perspective for the development, as soon as Africa is concerned, for the development of Africa. Thank you very much.
I think a new criteria, very objective, of what your age is whether you want 4 cameras or you don't, okay? So you're young, and the 2 of us are old. Okay, over to you. You've got 2 minutes left, and then we're done. Thank you. 2 minutes to you, and then let's tie up.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very good discussion, and I take back with me a lot of the comments that you put on the table. I think it opens also for us as an institutional, international organization working on this topic. You know, there are areas where we need to think deeper. There are areas where we need to, you know, think a lot about the risks, think about the narrative of, you know, how we present this in a development situation where the race for technology has no limit. So how do we also as an organization help you and help your countries take advantage of this tremendous opportunities that technology offer, but also working on making sure that the risks are contained. So it was a clear privilege for me to be with you this 1 hour and a half. Thank you very much for your time.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Shall we thank her?
Thank you so much. Yes.
All right, so I guess we can move on with our next panel. It is my pleasure to try to keep you guys awake in the very last panels of this day after some very interesting conversations, and very honored to be joined by two very prominent speakers, Mr. Ruud de Moij, Division Chief, Tax Policy Division at the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, as well as Senator Percy Down from Canada, who's at the same time Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Network of the World Bank and the IMF. The topic that we will be discussing is taxation as a tool for reducing inequalities. We've already discussed a number of issues and policies that could help countries reduce inequalities, and taxation was one of the things that was mentioned throughout the discussion so far. As we all know, if used properly, taxes can help create social equity, or at least increase it to some extent. But if not used properly, it can lead to tax evasion that can have difficult and wrong effects on economic growth. I will ask both of the speakers to discuss some of the issues or some of the experiences that they've seen in how taxation has been used positively as a tool for reducing inequalities, as well as whether they can talk to us about some of the cases when this has had the adverse or the opposite effect. So I'll first give the floor to Senator Percy Down. I think you have 5 to 7 minutes. I was extremely short, but probably that leaves you with another 1 or 2 minutes if you would like to take more time in your first introduction, and then we will hopefully have some more questions on this issue. Senator?
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk specifically about our job as members of Parliament. And our job, one of our main responsibilities, is to hold our government or revenue collecting agencies accountable. Are they doing the job that we think they're doing, which is to collect the taxes owed to our country? Are they keeping up with technology, or have they fallen behind? And let me give you a little case study of what's happening in Canada. Now, Canada, as you know, is a rich country by any standard, but we still have all kinds of inequality. The gentleman from Denmark talked about maternity leave for 12 months. We have that in Canada. We have health care, social benefits, and so on and so on. But we have a situation in our country where our Aboriginal communities, the residents of those communities, many of them have to boil the water. Just think about that. They don't have safe drinking water in Canada in 2019 in many of our Aboriginal communities. The government's trying to advance that. We all have programs that we think should be done in our country, and every time we raise the proposals, everybody nods. That's a wonderful suggestion. We should be doing that. But how are we going to pay for it? Well, one of the ways we pay for it is collecting taxes that are owed. And in Canada, we have various independent think tanks and so on. The Conference Board of Canada, one of our most respected think tanks, has estimated that our tax evasion in Canada is $40 billion a year, a significant amount of money. And what many of us in the Canadian Parliament have discovered is that our revenue agency does an outstanding job on domestic tax evasion. If you owe money, they're likely to catch you. But if you hide the money overseas, you're likely to get away with it. And where technology has come in recently and has highlighted the degree of the problem, we've all heard about the release from tax havens of Panama Papers, Paradise Papers. In the case of the Panama Papers, there were over 849 Canadians who had accounts there, individuals and corporations. And 3 years later, a host of countries around the world have collected and recovered money that was owing. Iceland, for example, with a population of a little over 325,000, collected 25 million. Germany 168 million, and on and on and on. The Canadian Revenue Agency, the government of Canada, has not collected 1 cent, zero. And this has undermined the confidence in our tax system, that there are two sets of rules, that if you're a domestic tax evader, you're likely to be caught. But if you have the financial resources to move your money offshore, overseas, to a tax haven, you're likely to get away with it. And this goes back to the question of inequality. How can we fund the programs we need? How can we get the money we need if a certain percentage of our population are not contributing their share? They're undermining the confidence in the tax system. They're refusing to participate in funding our nation. I mentioned earlier we have universal health care. I always say, I'm sure if somebody hiding the money overseas, if they or a member of their family becomes ill, they don't run off to a tax haven for medical treatment. They come to Canada, use their publicly funded healthcare system, but they don't want to pay for it. It's grossly unfair. It is a major problem in our country, and it leads to our lack of funding to address some of the social needs we have. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful introduction to a topic that may sound a little not that interesting when you read it, but the way you explained it, it shows that it can have so much effect in the everyday problems of the citizens in the countries we represent. I will pass it on to Mr. Demoich. Was that okay? Yeah, the way how I pronounced it? As I said, who leads the tax policy division at the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, and hopefully explain a little bit some of the practices that you're, or issues that you're facing with countries individually. I know the country that I represent, IMF is mentioned there on daily basis on issues that we're supposed to do, not supposed to do, especially on the fiscal area. So would really love to hear from you and what you have to say on how this has been used as a tool to deal with inequalities.
Thank you very much. So what keeps me busy all day is thinking about how to design tax policy for redistribution, how to efficiently sort of design the system to achieve redistributional objective in a way that is sort of gives you the best results for the country. So we do a lot of evidence-based analysis. We try to form views based on sort of the country-specific circumstances, and then we advise countries on how to go about with their tax design, both in value-added taxes, personal income taxes, and so on, to achieve more equitable outcomes, but also to do that in a way that is efficient. The result is that it's not always that governments follow up on the advice that we give, and the rhetoric in the public debate is often very different from the economic logic that we provide. And that reflects a number of persistent misperceptions. And what I would like to do is to give you a few examples of these misperceptions that I come across very often in the public debate. And I hope we can have some discussion on the political economy of tax reform, because that is, I think, essential also for my work in getting across the messages on what is good tax design to achieve the important redistributional objectives. The first I would like to emphasize is the misperception that regressive or proportional taxes are bad taxes. And that is a criticism that we often encounter, that we try to improve a system of value-added tax, or we try to introduce a carbon tax or excises, and that people say, but these are regressive taxes, these are not the taxes we want. What we say is that this is a too narrow view of the world. This is not the way in which to look at these taxes, because not every tax needs to be a progressive tax to be a good tax. Much of the reductions in inequality are caused by public expenditures. And public expenditures is the major instrument for achieving redistributive goals. So if you have a package of a regressive or a proportional tax to finance public expenditures that are progressive, this can be a very good policy, a good winner for the poor. So it's critical to look at both the tax and the spending side to get a good picture of what is the total impact of these policies. And essentially, the whole discussion on domestic revenue mobilization in countries is about revenue mobilization to enable these public expenditures. We need money to enable those expenditures. And this misconception can be very dangerous because it can hold up the progress and the development of countries that is really needed. So that's the first one, I think very important. The second one almost looks opposite, but it is more subtle, and that is the belief that progressive tax policy is something for the advanced economies and not for developing countries. And if we look at the data, then it looks a bit like that. If we look at advanced economies, then if you look at the Gini coefficient, before you apply taxes and transfers, that's about 0.45. And if you look after taxes and transfers, it's about 0.3. So you reduce inequality by about 1/3. And about 2/3 of that is caused by transfers and benefits and so on, and 1/3 is caused by progressive tax. So taxes do matter. If we then look at low-income countries and emerging market economies, and you do the same type of exercise, then the fiscal policies almost contribute nothing to reducing inequality. Basically, the personal income tax, which is usually the more progressive tax, is virtually absent, and spending on social benefits is also virtually absent. So there's very little fiscal redistribution. So people think, well, apparently this is something for advanced economies. But a lot can be done in terms of progressive taxation. And let me give 2 examples. First, in the design of the personal income tax. Most emerging market economies and low-income countries do have a personal income tax, and it is actually growing over the last couple of years. But in the design of these personal income taxes, 27 countries actually have designed it in a way that they have a flat personal income tax. They don't exploit variation in rates to tax higher the more wealthy individuals. And this is clearly a missed opportunity, because to offset these sort of more or less proportional income taxes, they start to introduce all kinds of exemptions in the VAT to try to make these more progressive. But that's the world upside down, because the most efficient instrument to achieve redistributional objective is the personal income tax, because you can utilize individual income information. And the VAT is a very blunt instrument to achieve that. So the design of sort of your tax system can really matter for how you achieve redistribution. The other example here is the taxation of high wealth individuals. And even for advanced countries, this can be problematic, and the design is often not conducive to actually achieve the distributional objective in the best possible way, because there's all kinds of exemptions, especially related to capital gains and inheritances. But for the developing countries, this is even more difficult, because these are taxes that are difficult to enforce, easy to evade and avoid. But still, a lot can be done, also in developing countries. Think, for instance, of the demonstrations of wealth in the form of property. Property taxes, recurrent property taxes, can be exploited much more, also in developing countries, to achieve redistributional objectives. These days, it's easy to identify properties through satellite technologies. We just talked about all these technologies. But the property tax can really benefit from these technologies to enforce such a tax, to build cadastres and to do the valuation. It's often more a matter of political will than it is the technologies. The last point is about the taxation of multinational companies. And the misconception here is that it becomes impossible to tax these companies. Now, this is a bit controversial, because ultimately companies don't pay tax. It's ultimately the underlying shareholders, it's people ultimately who bear the burden of tax, of course. But here it's believed that the corporate tax is typically a progressive tax because it's ultimately for a portion of it that the shareholders, who are the more wealthy people, who bear the brunt of the tax. Now, the corporate tax is under severe strain from internationalization, from international spillovers. First of all, because there is base erosion and profit shifting by multinational companies, and in particular in light of digitalization, with a lot of intangible assets which are easy to relocate, very hard to value, it is fairly easy to shift profits to low-tax jurisdictions. And we've done some analysis showing that for developing countries, 1.3% of GDP gets, the revenue gets forgone because of tax avoidance, which is much more than in, for instance, OECD countries, where it is slightly below 1% of GDP. So that's the first spillover, but there's also a second spillover, which is tax competition. Over the last 30 years, we have seen corporate tax rates tumbling down. 30 years ago, it was in the high 30s. These days, it's in the low 20s. But in emerging market economies and low-income countries, it is primarily tax competition in the form of tax incentives that abound, in the form of special economic zones, tax holidays, tax exemptions, and the revenue forgone is often much higher than the revenue forgone from base erosion and profit shifting. And this is a serious concern for many countries, this revenue loss. It's a deliberate revenue loss, a revenue forgone from these policies. And this can be disastrous for domestic revenue mobilization efforts, because many of these countries actually rely a lot on corporations for collecting revenue. Tax administration is usually less sophisticated than in advanced economies. They rely on simple ways of collecting the money. And simple means a large taxpayer unit collects from large companies. So taxing the companies is really important. And you see that in the data. In terms of the total revenue, corporate tax revenue in developing countries is about 16%. In advanced countries, it's about 8%. So it is really important. And giving the tax base away is a lost opportunity for many of these countries. Now, fortunately, there are now all these initiatives, global initiatives, basically to save the corporate income tax. There's now these discussions going on in response to digitalization, but also in response to the base erosion and profit shifting to try to solve the issue. And global coordination here is vital for a good solution. Equally vital is that the emerging market economies and low-income countries participate in this debate, to have their voice heard and to make sure that they have a good position in this discussion that reflects their interests. And reflecting their interest, the IMF does a lot of research trying to analyze the implications of various options for reform on the developing countries. And I think it's critical to keep an eye on sort of the interest. Interest can relate to what is the division of taxing rights between the source and the residence countries that is now at the table, is being discussed. And of course, the developing countries are much more often the source country rather than the residence country. It is important to keep an eye on that. And if you look at tax treaties, for instance, they do the opposite. They grant the taxing rights more to the residence countries at the expense of the source countries. When you think about the spillovers, it's essential for developing countries to address the spillovers from base erosion and profit shifting and from tax competition. So do these solutions actually offer a solution to these spillovers? And for developing countries, simplicity is critical. If we look at the complexity of the current rules, this is where a lot of the problems in the enforcement of the rules comes from. There's a very large agreement that the current system has become way too complex, and we need to think about sort of simplifying matters. So currently at the table are discussions about, for instance, moving to a new system based on the formulary methods to allocate profits, which are much simpler to apply than using these complicated arm's length prices for intangible assets. Also, there's discussions going on allocating taxing rights to destination countries, which is a principle which is much more robust compared to source or residence, because source or residence are easy to change, but destination of the consumer is much more robust to tax differences between countries. So there are these discussions going on, and I recommend everyone to think carefully about the position, what is in your interest, and participate in these discussions.
Thank you so much. Indeed, a very interesting presentation with lots of information in it. I would certainly open it up for questions or comments right now. We have a question from Canada first, followed by Morocco, number 2, and then we'll move on with Iraq, Congo, and someone sitting behind there, I can't really see. It's Nathan? Okay, and Nathan would be number 5. So 5 questions. I'm sure we have plenty of time, so please, sir.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the presentation. I'm intrigued about the destination country taxation and actual work going on in that regard. It's an issue that Canada's been struggling with. When you look at the major global tech companies and the fact that the rapidly increasing amount of transactional, volume of transactions that are occurring in a non-taxed manner in the nation country is, in my mind, a tremendous loss and an only growing loss for economies. And I would think especially those countries that are importing a lot more digital services than those who are exporting them. So I look at that and what are the strategies that are being pursued around the world? Canada, I think mistakenly, rather than addressing the issue head on, did a deal with Netflix, for example, to have Netflix invest in more intellectual property development in Canada, which they then own and benefit from in the host country of that organization, the United States, versus solving the problem directly through a direct taxation. So I'd like to know what is happening on this issue specifically, because I think it's a growing problem. Well, it is a growing problem.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. شكرا أيضا ل
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair.
سؤالي يتعلق بالاقتصاد الغير المهيكل. نعرف أن في عدد من الاقتصاديات أن الاقتصاد وعدد من الدول في عدد من الدول النامية الاقتصاد غير المهيكل يشكل أحيانا ما يقارب 50% من الاقتصاد المهيكل.
Sense of the official economy.
عليها مع العلم.
Ask you just to stop for a second. We're not getting any translation for your question.
The voice. I'm not getting the voice. Yeah. Yeah. It's okay. No, it's okay now. Now I can. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, now it's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Je dois reprendre.
So I'm going to repeat.
شكرا. إذن.
Thank you. In the beginning, I was talking about this important topic, which is tax collection and the role of tax collection in limiting the disparities, limiting the differences. And my question is related to unstructured economy. We know that in the developing countries, the percentage of unstructured economy is very high, and it forms pressure on the structured economy and the companies that work in a systematic manner. So in this non-structured economy, it is an ability to collect tax, which is very important to these countries. A very large number of people who work in non-structured economy are those people who are concerned with social differences. What kind of advice would the IMF provide us with for the developing economies in order to reduce or to limit, or let's say to be able to make it possible for the companies and individuals and those who work in the unstructured economy to be part of the system, because it is very important for the tax system? Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. I think that this issue is very important. One of the most important issues that have been discussed today regarding the tax system and how to have fairness in distribution of tax. We in Iraq, we still suffer from a tax system that is very, very old. And a team from the International Monetary Fund in 2017 has provided us with a report. And this report included how to implement a modern tax system and how to collect the tax in Iraq. We know that in Iraq, our revenues are only oil revenues, and the prices of oil fluctuate continuously, and this led to deficit in the budget since 2014 because we rely on oil mainly. But we have faced so many problems in implementing this tax system, the new system in Iraq. We faced a very big problem. And this would take me to a certain point. I would like to focus on technology. Here is very important in this regard. Technology is important in tax collection because we do not have a database. We do not have a big database or an accurate one until now, despite the fact that we all seek to do that. The government is trying to get, and the World Bank and also the IMF is trying to help us to get a balanced tax collection. But so far we do not have this, and we have a problem with collection or being fair in collecting tax. I believe that until now we do not have fairness. So I don't know if the IMF and working in Iraq, I don't have sufficient information. Has the IMF succeeded so far to amend and modify the tax collection system in all the sectors? Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Madam. My question is this. How can we increase the tax base? Because in a lot of developing countries, people don't want to pay taxes because they don't really understand what the taxes are used for. They're saying we're paying taxes to put money in the pockets of the leaders, but so it's not really useful. The result is that governments tend to choke economic operators, stifle them by imposing taxes on them, and the economy is stifled, and we do not derive the benefits of the taxation system. According to you, what is the optimal approach for developing countries that would allow us to help the population understand why it is important that each of them pay if we want the country to develop? And how should we proceed vis-à-vis the large companies, in particular the mining sectors in the DRC, and which are, I'm sorry to say, very talented when it comes to hiding their income? And how do you reconcile all of this with the goal to increase the funding available to the governments to invest in social sectors and services?
Nathan?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. According to this, it looks is talking more about the developing world. And that's where inequality is basically found in taxation. But who are the biggest invaders of tax. These are multinationals. These multinationals come from developed countries. They come in a developing world. They practice what we call transfer pricing, whereby they make sure in that country of a developing world, they load costs of production, costs of everything, so that there's either negative tax there, or making losses, or they pay little tax. So it means the chief invaders of tax are from the multinational in the developed world. My question is, how has the developed world come up to assist in this process of tax evasion? Because multinationals employ the best accountants, employ the best technology, employ the best lawyers and the systems. So how has the multinationals, rather how has the developed world, including World Bank and IMF, come up to deal with tax evasions through the multinationals?
And we have a final question here.
Final question, yes. Thank you very much. I just would like to say that in this respect, we have not only to contextualize, but we have to conceptualize. To contextualize because you have different situations in different countries. I am coming from Senegal, where you have the French system. There's no way you can escape. When you're a civil servant, 1/3 of your salary is to pay tax. I live in the country, which is Saudi Arabia. For 27 years, you don't pay tax. They're rich enough with the oil revenue that to the citizen of Saudi Arabia, no matter how rich you are, you're not paying tax. Whenever the government trying to change the situation, you have kind of right. So they withdraw the proposal. And you have the first intervention I made when I became an MP was about mining taxation. It was my first intervention. I realized that there was a lot of, like my brother put it, multinational. There's nothing illegal. By contract and by agreement, they allow not to pay tax for the coming 25 years. Yeah, you have these 3 different cases. And to have a combat inequality, you have to master and to understand those 3 systems. I never understood the situation of Saudi Arabia. I left about 5 years ago. I don't know what is the situation now. But this is what I lived there 27 years. You don't pay your tax. Now, for conceptualizing, there's one concept you're using in IMF, fiscal transparency. I don't know if you link to the budget or to taxation. I just would like to be, to be educated in this respect. I thank you very much.
Oh, we have another one. Please go ahead.
Sorry, you hadn't just seen my hand, sorry. Just related to what my colleagues have stated, I just wanted your views on this, how these issues of tax incentives, exemptions in the name of attracting investors plays to the disadvantage of the developed countries in the name of attracting investors. Yet in the end, after giving exemptions, incentives in terms of tax exemptions, when they make a lot of money, they repatriate the profits. They don't plow it back. And this to the detriment of the citizens of the country. How is the World Bank and IMF looking at this?
There are more questions coming in. So probably I could have divided them into 2 different rounds, but if there are no more questions apart from the one coming from Canada, perhaps we can take that one and then answer everything at once. So no more questions. So this is, actually there are 2. Do you want to answer the ones that you got so far or take, yeah. Let's answer the first 7 questions And then I'll come back to you for the 2 additional questions or others. And Senator, if you want to step in after we get the answer from Mr. Demoij, please feel free to do so. Sir?
Thank you very much. No, thanks a lot for the questions. So let me try to answer them in reverse order, starting with the one on tax incentives. So on tax incentives, the IMF and the World Bank have done a lot of work, a lot of analytical work on the effectiveness, on the efficiency, and on the governance of these instruments. And in 2015, we had a joint paper, together also with the OECD and the UN, where we evaluate the use of tax incentives for attracting investment. And it provides a lot of evidence that's been collected over the years on these effectiveness in a number of countries. And what we find, for instance, in terms of effectiveness, is that tax incentives tend to be very ineffective overall, in the sense that you need these tax incentives to attract a certain investment. Even if you ask the investors, would you have come also without the tax incentive, then between 80 and 90% says, yes, I would have come also without the tax incentive. So it's a redundant tax break for these companies. They would have come also without, and that's what they say, but even the ones who say they would not have come might have come anyway, so this is just to give an illustration on effectiveness. You also see that in the list of sort of what are the important factors for investors to come to a certain location. Then tax incentives usually appear as number 10, 11, after all these other factors that are much more important, like the size of the markets, the quality of the legal system, infrastructure. These factors are much more important. So if you would have collected the money and would have invested in infrastructure, you might have done a better deal probably for these companies. In terms of efficiency, and that relates also to the question on transparency in tax matters, what is very important is that also parliamentarians, every decision maker has the full picture of what is the cost of providing certain tax measures, tax breaks, tax incentives, tax exemptions. Because for spending, we always have a nice budget. We see exactly what it costs to have this expenditure. But for expenditures that work through the tax system, through these specific tax breaks, it is often not clear how much is the revenue forgone. So what is the fiscal cost of these measures? It's often unclear. So for fiscal transparency, it's really essential to determine what is the revenue forgone from these measures. And for these tax incentives, there are many studies that have tried to do that, and the IMF and the World Bank do that on a regular basis in countries, also trying to help countries do that themselves, so that sort of to have this as a regular part of the budget, to inform parliamentarians, to inform every decision maker on the revenue forgone. From these studies, it appears that the revenue forgone from tax incentives can be huge. Sometimes 1-2% of GDP is forgone through all these tax holidays, special economic zones. So this is a huge revenue cost, and that's just the revenue cost, because there are other costs associated with these incentives as well. And in particular, if the governance is weak, which is the case in many countries, there are often discretionary tax incentives that are decided upon by a handful of people. This may also feed corruption, for instance, which is detrimental for the trust in government. The gentleman from Congo mentioned how can we make sure people pay? Well, I think an essential element of this is trust. We need to trust the people who collect the money and who spend the money. Trust in government is really vital here. And I think transparency can also contribute to building this trust. So on the multinationals, the question there at the back on multinationals as the biggest tax evaders. Well, actually, many of these multinationals do not evade tax. They don't break the law. They basically remain within the law, but they avoid tax. So they use the differences in laws in order to avoid paying tax in your country, because the income is reported in a country that has no corporate income tax, where they don't have to pay anything. But the income is reported somewhere. It's just that they play the game of differences in tax rules between countries. And I think the solution is not so much that we need to enforce the rules, because they play by the rules. We need to change the rules. And I think that is the essence of tax avoidance. You have to find ways to protect your tax base. And I think in terms of the multinationals, what the development has been is that there are more strict rules in terms of what cost can you deduct from your taxable income, for instance. Let's take as an example interest. Interest in the past was unlimited to be deducted from a company's tax bill. So how many interest there was, it was all deductible. So with BEPS, there was a limit on how much you can actually deduct. So this is now capped in terms of the deductibility of those costs. Now, I think for developing countries, applying these rules can be really complicated. Applying the transfer pricing guidelines that are developed by the OECD to your country can be extremely complicated. And you're dealing with very sophisticated companies with a bunch of lawyers. It is an unequal game, I guess. But what you can do is develop your own rules in terms of capping certain costs. So why not cap not only interest costs that can be deductible, but also royalty costs or service fees, management fees to headquarters. You can impose rules that limit the cost and that protect your tax base. Or you can impose withholding taxes on certain payments, on royalty payments, on interest payments. But there's a risk here. If you have signed treaties that say the maximum withholding tax rate is 0, then you have no opportunity for that payments to impose this tax. Therefore, also be very cautious in signing such treaties with very low withholding tax rates. You have to protect your tax base in all these manners, by simple rules, by having withholding taxes, and by not signing bad treaties, and have a very well thought out treaty strategy for your country. So it's a lot is sort of legal avoidance here. Now, when it comes to sort of the implementation, the question from Congo, also the question from Iraq and Morocco, all deal with sort of compliance. How can we make sure there is proper compliance? And I think you also talked about the tax administration. This is really the implementation of the rules. I think what is important for countries, first of all, is to design the policies that you can really administer. You should not design the policies that are the same as in advanced economies, because some of these policies may be very difficult to administer. So you may have to rely on simpler taxes sometimes, taxes that can be withheld as soon as the payment takes place, because when a payment takes place, you can observe it, and there can be third-party information that gives you the information you need to enforce the tax. So don't rely on self-reporting of individuals, because these individuals, as you say, they don't want to pay tax, they don't trust the government. So if enforcement is difficult, they won't pay the tax. So rely on withholding mechanisms from large taxpayers, from third parties that are the custodians of the tax administration to collect the tax. And even then, it is very important to have all the basics of a proper tax administration in place. And what the IMF often does is we give not only advice on tax policy design, but we follow up with our legal experts. We have a legal department that does the drafting of tax laws. And the quality of the law is really important for the next step, which is the ones who are going to enforce the law, the tax administrations. And with the tax administrations, the biggest department in fiscal affairs is our Revenue Administration Division, because that's where most of the support is needed in countries. So they design sort of the basics of a good tax administration with compliance improvement plans to ensure that the compliance is improving, but also with the implementation, with local experts following up on sort of the recommendations given at the higher level. That is the way we try to sort of build capacity in countries to ensure that the compliance is improved, that the tax morale is improved, But it also requires sort of efforts from the government that there is trust in government, because if you pay and you know that the money is not well spent, then the incentive to pay can be very weak. So it's also a matter of credibility and trust in government, which is vital for the tax morale. Then maybe finally the question from Canada on destination-based taxation. There's a lot happening in terms of the digital economy. We've seen responses, especially from countries where basically all these users are based and the consumers are based of Amazon and so on, the users of Facebook, the users of Google, where the countries had no ability to tax the income from the companies that provided these services. And this led to a huge discomfort with these countries, because most of these companies were based in the US, so the US had the taxing right because there was the physical presence. There was no physical presence in all the other countries. So huge discomfort, and I think it was inherently perceived as unfair that how we currently allocate taxing rights across countries. And that things had to change in the digitalized economy in how we organize things. So it's really sort of a fairness matter. That's how this was born. And what countries started to do is individually introducing taxes on digital services, for instance. So they could not tax the profits. The treaties prevented them from saying, well, we assume a digital presence, for instance, because a treaty takes two to tango, right? So you need to agree on the treaty with the other partner to change the definition of what is a permanent establishment, what is physical presence. So you can't do that by yourself. So with the inability to do that, you need ideally an international agreement to do that. Countries started to think of digital service tax, so taxes on the sales of internet advertisements. If Google sells all these Google AdWords to a country, there can be an additional 3% sales tax on that. So that's what countries started to implement. Europe came with their own proposal. But that led to sort of a discussion where every country wanted to grab a piece of sort of the profit of those companies. It can lead to double taxation. It can lead to all kinds of spillovers, distortions in markets. This is not a solution that would be the best for the world. So in the task force for the digital economy, in 2015, there was no agreement on how to deal with that. It was asked, can you come up with a solution by 2020? And that is the debate that is currently going on in the inclusive framework on how to deal with the digital economy. And what they came up with last week was a proposal on a new taxing right. So a new taxing right for the destination country. So it introduces a new concept of sort of not physical presence, but taxable presence, only based on sales. So if there are sales in a country, you can already have taxable presence and having the taxing rights. And they had a rather vague still proposal for how to allocate a portion of the profit to those countries where the sales take place, based on sort of a formulary approach, a simplified formulary approach. And that's all driven by sort of this equity. But I think what the IMF, for instance, has emphasized is that allocating taxing rights to destination countries might also be more robust to international spillovers, because it's ultimately where the final consumer resides, where you give the taxing rights. So if you have tax differences, tax rate difference between these countries, consumers will not immediately move, so the taxing rights will also not immediately move. What we do see now with the source and residence, because source, it's easy to manipulate source, the source of an intangible asset. So it's very easy to manipulate that. It's also easy to change your residence. And we've seen that with all these inversions in the US, or with the location of headquarter companies in certain countries. So that's sort of much more mobile and less robust to international spillovers than sort of this. So it has some appeal to move in the direction of giving taxing rights also to destination countries from the perspective of a robust system. And it's moving in that direction. I think there's still a lot of sort of unknown parameters in the current debates, and I think it's really important for all countries, especially also the developing countries, to think through what this means for them. Because these new taxing rights cannot lead to double taxation. You cannot create a new taxing right and say, well, we're going to tax the multinationals 20% extra. It has to come at the expense of something. So keep an eye on that, because it really matters for the opportunities for your taxing rights.
Thank you very much. Senator?
I'll be very brief. I want to follow up on the question from the colleague from Congo. I think it's very important that members of parliament follow up on two separate streams. One we do on a regular basis. What does the money that goes to the government actually do for the citizens? How is it spent? And we try to have, in all our countries, an oversight role in that. But I think the second question is the fairness of the collection, and that's what you were referring to. That undermines the tax system. If citizens think the government may be wasting the money, that's one job for members of parliament, to hold the government to account on behalf of the citizens. But if the citizens think that they're being treated differently than other citizens, then why should they participate in paying their taxes? And part of that is an educational program. You pay taxes, that means we have roads. You pay taxes, that means we have schools, and so on. But the second part is an enforcement, that those who don't pay taxes should be held to account. The Revenue Collection Agency should be held to account. And let me give you an illustration of that in Canada. The Canadian government refuses to do a tax gap analysis, the difference between what they collect and what they should be collecting. All kinds of countries around the world have done this. It gives you a basis. It's very hard to do, extremely difficult. I'm sure you could go on for some time, but it does give you a framework, a ballpark figure, if you will, of how short you are. In my earlier comments, I talked about the Conference Board of Canada, or think tank, that came up with the estimate of $40 billion a year not being paid to the Canadian government that should be paid, domestic and overseas, mostly overseas tax evasion. But the reality is that's a guesstimate. They don't know. I don't know. More importantly, the government of Canada doesn't know, because they don't track this. And this is part of the evolving technology. The flip side of the technology is, of course, we now have all these leaks. We realize the degree of the problem. But we had an example in Canada 8 or 9 years ago where there was one tax haven, Liechtenstein, which I'll name, where Canadians had accounts in the bank. 102 Canadians had account there, $200 million. The Liechtenstein leak, the information was shared with countries around the world. The Australians, for example, immediately formed a task force, tracked down these people. Suddenly, people were picking up the newspaper and seeing their neighbor was charged. Somebody was convicted. Somebody went to jail. The Australians tell us the interest in hiding your money overseas fell dramatically, and the rest of the citizens saw people paid a price for trying to cheat and corruption. Unfortunately, none of that happened in Canada, because even though we had 200 million in that one bank, not one person got charged, therefore no one got convicted. So the interest in hiding your money overseas increased in Canada rather than decreased, because there's no individual cost for cheating the system and for corruption. So I think those two together, the educational on one hand and the enforcement on the other, helps raise your tax base.
Thank you so much. We have 2 more questions, please. The MP from Canada, and then we have the gentleman sitting behind. Can't really see
yes,
your name. Kenya? Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, this is a very interesting conversation and dialogue we're having. I just wanted to, because I have lived in a developing country and a developed country, I know that the tax systems are very different, and that in some countries well, in most countries, tax evasion is illegal, but aggressive tax avoidance is legal. So we have to make the difference in both. But because I live in Canada and because I follow very close what my colleague Senator Downey is explaining, I can tell you that tracking down these tax evaders, it requires a special police, a special tax lawyers and accountants, and one of the reasons because Canada is lagging behind is because the government got rid of these police people. So we need political will. We need political will to establish back again these bodies for inquiry and investigation. But I also want to talk about something that I think it's a tool. The open parliaments in the Americas, we have the friendship among the parliaments, and we have this goal of attaining open parliaments, which means that everything it's open. It's using technology and digital information. Every citizen can go and know how much money has received, if he's lobbied, not lobbied, received money, etc. And so corruption is there at the center of this tax evasion and this aggressive tax avoidance, and open parliaments could be a way of reducing this dark area in the tax world. Thank you.
May ask you to be as short as possible because our next panel is already here, so we'll need to wrap up in 2 minutes.
Right, yeah, mine is still touching on what I had contributed earlier under technology, the issue of the digital market. Yeah, on this one, on taxation, we are talking about two issues where we are talking about the physical presence of a service provider and the location of the customer. Now that it is becoming an issue, the two issues will have to be addressed in a way that if we are recognizing that now the world is becoming global, then we need to look at what taxes will be will benefit the country in which the service provider is, and what kind of taxes can benefit the country where the customer is located. For instance, I was thinking loudly and saying that suppose we say that taxes which are like corporate tax, which are taxed on the service provider, will benefit the country where the service provider is physically located, while where the customer will be located, then the global agreements can use taxes like excise duty on the service consumed, so that it doesn't really bring a lot of conflict in terms of how can we collect these taxes. So that if you are in Canada and you are consuming a service which is offered by a corporate in US, then the US government, Canadian government is allowed then to levy some excise duty on that consumption. Then it will really avoid the issues of who benefits from what. Then the US then will tax the service provider under corporation tax. I think that's what I was suggesting.
Please.
Okay. Thank you very much for these questions. I think on the first question on the evaders, I think many tax administrations do have a special police, a high wealth individual unit, for instance. And what they've done is they often compute the rate of return from adding additional officer in that unit in terms of how much revenue it generates. And these amounts are enormous. In New Zealand, for instance, the rate of return to adding an additional officer is very high. I think also you mentioned third-party information reporting, which is really important, which also deals with privacy legislation, of course. So how much can the government collect, and does it impede with privacy sensitive information? But I think third-party information reporting is really important for enforcing taxes on high wealth individuals. And I think, of course, the development in automatic exchange of information across borders is really a development that enables countries much better than in the past to mitigate evasion of these taxes. So I think the prospect for enforcing these taxes is improving over time. And I think the automatic exchange of information has just started. So if that really sort of works, I think this really allows for much better prospects for taxing. I think on the digital market, I think these are very interesting observations. I think there's also issues related to VAT, for instance. How are these services treated under the VAT? And if we think, for instance, of Facebook, Facebook is sort of a barter transaction between the user of Facebook, who gets these services for free, but who pays with his information, with his data. So there's no real transactions, but there is kind of a transaction, right? So how should this be treated also under the VAT? So there's corporate tax issues, there's excise issues, but there's also VAT issues that we need to think about sort of in the design of these the new digital economy.
Well, thank you so much. This was a very interesting topic, quite insightful discussions and quite interesting questions as well. Let me thank you all for this and also thank our speakers once again. So let me then invite the next speakers in the panel. I'll be staying here, so you'll have to. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you both here. All right, so let me welcome you to our final panel, and the topic is managing debt to fight inequalities. I'm joined by two very prominent speakers, by Mr. Marcello Estevao, is that the right pronunciation? That's okay. Yes. Who's the Global Director for Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment at the World Bank Group. He leads quite a large group of economists that deal with these extremely important issues. And also with the Honorable Elijah Okupa, who's an MP from Uganda, a member of the Committee on Commission, State Authorities, and State Enterprises. And we don't have Senator Damien Regnard here, which is why I'm, again, moderating this panel. I will ask the two speakers to briefly speak for about 5 to 7 minutes at the beginning so that we allow enough space for questions. As you can see, there is quite a lot of interest from our MPs. We will have to finish by 5:15, so I will give the floor to Mr. Estevao first, and then I'll ask Elijah to continue with the discussion, sir.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon. I'm glad to be here today. As Ms. Osmani Sadriou mentioned, this is one of the topics that is under my purview. There is actually a large global team under me that does all the debt work for the World Bank. The way I would typify this work is, what's the main objective? The main objective is to achieve development goals, okay? Countries can achieve those objectives in different ways. The core here is independent on the way you actually collect means to achieve those objectives, because there is a role of public policies to achieve those objectives, that those resources need to be well spent. Okay, so that's a key thing here. We can talk about taxation. There was a session on taxation, on how to mobilize more resources to be able to spend to achieve those development goals, or you can borrow in the market or from international organizations to achieve those goals. The key thing here is, whatever you do, you better spend well, because at the end of the day, the calculation the policymakers are making is, I'm going to say, in the case of debt, that is the issue of this session, I'm going to borrow $1 extra, one extra local currency, and then I'm going to invest in X, Y, and Z. That can be education, can be infrastructure. That is going to have an impact on growth and on welfare. And then this is going to give me resources at the end to pay back the debt. If that calculation doesn't work, you shouldn't be borrowing. So that's the basic thing here, because you should be borrowing just if you can pay back. And paying back in the development sense is making sure that this investment is done in a way that really increases the production capability of the countries and the productivity. And that way you produce wealth, and then you are able to pay this money back. What's happening in practice? In practice, that this is a quite hard equation to close. There are many uncertainties. Maybe there are some investments that there's an uncertainty if it's going to pay off or not. What we've seen the last several years, since I would say 2013, is an increase in indebtedness in IDA countries on average, which is something that is somewhat worrisome, and because this measures debt as a ratio to GDP. That is worrisome because it could be a sign that part of this indebtedness either was not well used in terms of how you're using money to produce more output, more wealth in your country, to boost development, or the returns to this investment are very much the long term, and in this between, the countries may get a bill that is, you need to pay this debt back. So we are paying attention. There is about 50% of IDA countries are either in a debt crisis or about to be in one, so they are at a risk, a high risk of a debt crisis. So we are keeping an eye on that. In our work, we are engaging with these countries on maybe how to improve debt management offices, so that you can do a better liability management, and that may help you push a bit forward this day that you have to pay back the debt. So that's one key thing we are doing, is TA and capacity development. Another thing then that the country teams are doing is exactly working on development programs so that you get a return from these investments sooner rather than later. And here, I think that's basically the key message. The key message is that can be a great thing if it's well used. And right now, we do see kind of inconsistent evidence if this debt has been well used or not, with some countries doing maybe a bit better job investing on activities that will really give return, while others are not in that much of a good shape. But the good news is that we are here to help, and this type of debate is very useful, so we can find solutions to the issue together.
Thank you very much. Mr. Okupa, please.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, moderator. I think my colleague has really done the work. Why do we need the debt? Why do we borrow? We borrow, for us to help the countries, the rest of countries, to fill up the gap which the domestic revenues possibly could not be able to meet. So in filling that gap, have these resources been used effectively or not? But also we see in the third world, in Africa, in my country, that all of it, some of these resources have led to some significant growth, but also in some cases we have seen that there have been challenges, but they have been building over time. And possibly we need to get to understand why the public debt keeps increasing, but at the same time, the level of inequality in some cases has continued rising. I think the reasons as to why we end up having those complaints, I think one of them is, which I talked earlier on, the issues of transparency, the issues of governance in most cases, but also we find that in most cases some cases where reasons that lead to that are external in nature. So, as lawmakers, what should we do in order to ensure that the money that is borrowed is used for the right purpose and achieves the right objective, but also making sure that we don't borrow money which in the end we fail to pay? Because in most cases we have seen in African countries where they have ended up issuing with the Euro bonds, which of course have a short time, for maybe 5 to 10 years, they are borrowing them for infrastructure development. But I think what legislatures do, giving an example of my country, is first of all, on top of me being in that committee that the moderator stated, I serve in the Committee of National Economy. We have developed checklist where, as parliamentarians, you check on, as you discuss with the government, the Minister of Finance, whether this checklist has been followed before we approve. It's not just a matter of borrowing money, and then in the end you fail to achieve the objective, or it ends up being abused. We have had a situation where the government is tending to borrow money with the anticipation that the oil revenues will come 2020, come 2021. Suppose the prices drop, what are you going to do? Suppose you fail to achieve a goal, what happens? So these are some of the things as Parliament we look at. We also looked at the laws. Of course, the government of Uganda, together with the Parliament, passed the Public Finance Management Act in order to check the use of these resources. So these are some of the things that legislators do. Of course, the other one is the oversight role. When the laws are passed, because for Uganda's case, every loan must have the approval of Parliament, such that we know government cannot borrow money outside Parliament, such that we are able to monitor and follow it up. So it does not only stop at the approval level, but parliaments follow it up to ensure that the money has been used for the purposes. But of course, that has also not been easy. We have had cases where the money has been eaten up through corruption. So it is a challenge, but of course that needs to be addressed. That's why Parliament still went ahead to pass laws to deal with those who have misappropriated the resources. We also follow the guidelines, the debt management guidelines developed by the World Bank and IMF. I think it's one of those that I think the World Bank and IMF needs to popularize among the legislators, such that when they are passing the loans, they should be able to follow whether they meet those guidelines, not just borrowing for purposes of just consumption. So these are some of the things as a Parliament we have attempted to do. Of course, there are a number of reasons why the public debt, or the causes why there has been an increase in the public debt across the third world or Africa or African countries, sub-Saharan especially. There are a number of them. I don't have enough time to go into detail, but of course some of them are like global financial crisis that faced the world, the 2014 terms of trade shock, low domestic savings, the growing financial requirements or needs, especially to finance the infrastructure, the exchange rate depreciation, poor governance. So all of this, at the moment, I think for Uganda's case, we have reached 42.2 of the GDP, and that is showing a red flag that because we shouldn't reach if we continue borrowing at that rate with all other factors, so then we are at the risk of reaching the 50% mark, which is set by the World Bank. So there should be need to check such that we don't go beyond that, where it becomes a crisis in our country. So, but by and large, public debt is not bad per se, but it must be used for correct purposes, because we have seen in Uganda it has led to the real GDP growth rates for the last 5 years. We saw the real GDP growth rate from the year 2014 to 15 rise from 5.2 in 2015-2019 financial year. It was 4.8, but again it went down to 3.9 in 2016-2017, but again it went up to 6.2, and it's now stagnating about 6.1. But this is all as a result of using the resources for the right purposes. So that's what I can say for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for raising the issue of transparency. There are so many instances where the people in a certain country don't really understand what public debt is and how that can affect not just their lives, but especially the future generation. We got a few young boys and girls that are doing IT apps and projects. They issued in Kosovo a calculator which shows every second how much the debt in Kosovo is rising. And it kind of created quite a lot of information for the people who didn't even know what this is, because it shows every second how it changes. And it's scary when you see it this way. It's really scary, and you understand what is really happening. And so it's just it's a number, but when you see it moving on so fast, it shows that something is wrong in managing public debt. But I will open it up for questions, but perhaps I can start with one. For some countries, foreign direct investment is extremely important, if not for all. So maybe if you could tell us how managing public debt plays a role in making foreign investors think that a certain country is the proper place to invest in. So that's one question from me, and we'll have more from the MPs here, starting from the MP from Canada, then Congo, and there's Kenya, and is it Nathan again? All right, so we have another 4 questions. Please go ahead, sir, madam.
Thank you. I couldn't stop remembering something that happened 40 years ago when I left Peru to go to Canada. I received the man who became my husband, and he said, Peru and Canada had exactly the same level of foreign debt, but I am here in Peru and I don't see why you are in debt, because there is no infrastructures. And you know, I am very happy to say that things have changed a lot in Peru, and it has to do a lot with fighting corruption. But what I can tell you too is that in my professional career, going into developing countries, I many times I found this situation, which is that, for example, in the extractive industry, international and transnational companies goes to extract minerals, polymetallics, petroleum to developing countries, and they are expected to construct hospitals, they are expected to construct highways, they are expected to construct infrastructures, and they are more and more complaining that that is not their role. But that is the way that some countries have, some regions and some communities have found as a solution to corruption, because then they can keep the money and see that this is invested in a school, in universities, in hospitals, and in infrastructure. So back again into the transparency, we should be talking not only about open parliaments and parliamentarians, but this should trickle down to regional governments, municipal governments, if we want to have transparency and keep the money where the resources came. Thank you.
Join Canada.
I must deface Canada. Thanks. Two issues, basically. One is on the issue of the philosophy behind World Bank and IMF on one hand, and then the other one is the whole issue of debt, and particularly the issue of sources of debt that we have in most of the developing countries. Number one is in terms of the philosophy behind IMF and World Bank for purpose of reconstruction. It's a reconstructive engagement in terms of the economies that are either torn in one way or the other. And most of these economies that we are talking about are really torn off, and there are fights constantly on all manner of things. Some are smaller that you cannot even compare with what maybe the World Bank and IMF have been addressing after the post-World War II. So if you look at that, and you look at the situations that we have in some of these developing countries, conflicts are constant, and there are conflicts that are not as major and as not big as those world wars, but they are causing a lot of havoc in most of these countries. Yet, on the other hand, when it comes to issue of borrowing, World Bank, IMF make it so hard for these countries to borrow to an extent that they end up borrowing from very expensive sources. They go for syndicated loans, they go for commercial loans, and yet we have the World Bank and IMF which can give of this kind of bilateral arrangements in a manner that is a little bit cheaper. So how do we connect the two? The process of trying to reconstruct the economies on one hand, and on the other hand, the idea of the rigid way of how debts or loans are supposed to be transferred to some of these countries under stress.
Merci de la parole. La question, elle est...
Thank you for giving me the floor. I have a simple question. Many African countries have reached the PPTE achievement point, especially for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we had the cancellation of 80% of the debt. And we are amongst the most under-indebted countries, whereas we have an indebtedness capacity because of the fact that our GDP, if we take the example of the United States, where debt is approximately the equivalent of its GDP, we are not at all at that level. So what are the policies that could be considered and developed that would be credible and would allow us to have more access to international financing and funding to fund the development of our own country?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I never heard about local debt. Basically, a government wants to fund a budget, it issues treasury bills, and it goes to the most people buy treasury bills are mostly commercial banks. And this means the money which would be available for investment is taken in treasury bills, and leading cost of capital in that country to be high. And this suffocates economy. I wanted to hear from World Bank, what plans do you have to such countries which deal in treasury bills? And secondly, governments which get credit from suppliers locally who don't pay on time. At the end, these businessmen collapse, run bankrupt. Is that economic growth at debt? And finally, China, are you aware of China? China gives nowadays credit without conditions almost. And many African countries, developing countries, are going there, and these are very expensive loans. At the end, they're paying more for these loans because vis-a-vis for development, what is the strategy of World Bank to assist developing countries to manage this debt so that it can reduce inequality in a way that the money which is being used to service this debt can be in a country to provide us social services?
It's me.
We have a few more questions, please, sir. And
Thank you, madam. I just want to raise 3 issues. One, I don't know whether World Bank and IMF know that the debt which most developing economies accumulate largely benefits the government officials, and that even when it benefits the government officials, I also don't know whether World Bank knows and IMF that most governments do not explain to the masses, to their citizens, that actually the money they are using for infrastructure development and other developments in their country is borrowed money. Because most citizens are blindfolded to the extent that governments actually misinform the public that it is money that they have raised locally. And so people do not even bother to do critical and serious monitoring of this borrowed money. Finally, the other trend that is coming in, I don't know whether also World Bank and IMF are aware, this Islamic banking, that actually it is turning out to be more attractive to most people because you share the burden, you also share the profits. Just in case there is a loss, you share the loss. If there is a profit, you share the profit. I don't know whether you are aware that actually that is another trend that is coming in, and most people could in future run for more of Islamic banking because it is more attractive to most developing countries.
Thank you, my chair. I think in my own country, Nigeria, we have quite a lot in terms of borrowings. My question is, I'm quite aware that the World Bank Group, Nigeria owes the World Bank Group about $7.8 billion, which are quite like 51% of the about $15.35 billion that Nigeria owes. And to me, is there anything the World Bank is doing to see that this number of debts being owed by these countries, is there a way that they can reduce it? Because if you look at it now, my country is going to China to get funding, especially in terms of railway and power. And even the Chinese are so much engaged in the construction of power and rail lines. And also IMF has been disturbing so many African countries, especially my country, in terms of removing fuel subsidies, which will further put so much hardship to the poor and the masses in these countries. And also, my brother here just talked about the Islamic banking. I'm quite aware that even my country got some funding through, I don't know if the World Bank know about Skook, which was used to fund some infrastructure projects like the roads. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important subject. I think that the debt in general is not the issue if not considered within the ratios. It should be always considered with the ratio of the GDP. So the debt should be very less than 70% of the GDP, which will make it fruitful debt. And another issue which I consider very important is where we utilize this debt. Is it going for a current expenditure or is it going for investment expenditure? Any country who lend more money for a current expenditure will decrease its businesses and will reduce the economy in that country. So I think that the debt should be considered where is it going exactly. Sometimes the debt is essential for the growth of the economy when it's for the investment. And the more important thing is that you have mentioned before the transparency and the easy of access for information for the people and for the parliamentarians to know where is this debt being utilized and where is it going exactly. One more thing is that the debt has to be considered within the repay period and how much we are paying interest or service for this debt. Some debts with a high interest will also hardly affect the economy and the country in general. That was only a comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we have no more questions, then I'll pass it on to Sir Esteval for answers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, these are great questions, and they really match the work program of the World Bank on that. First, your question on debt policy and FDI, that's quite related on other questions about the importance of transparency and all that. So the worst things that can happen to a country that is really trying to reach higher levels of income is to keep having that crisis. That's something that is, the knowledge on this, academic research, policy research is quite clear. If you want to grow, if you want to keep going up in terms of your income per capita, say, we can talk about distribution issues as well, but you better not have that crisis because they are really disruptive for your development strategies. So that should be a key motivation for governments to be quite careful when borrowing. So when you make this, when you borrow, for instance, you need to look at what's the best estimate for your trend growth in the country, so GDP growth. That hopefully is higher, or at least about the same of the real interest rate that you're paying on the debt. If it is not, that's a problem because you're basically guaranteeing that your debt to GDP ratio is going to be going up as time passes, unless you're investing in such an amazing project that makes GDP grow faster. So you need to have these basic calculations before you borrow, first of all. Second, for you to attract more FDI, you better have your fiscal accounts in shape because if you go into a debt crisis, like I said, one of the worst things that can happen to a country that is trying to grow consistently. Foreign investors are going to be very wary about putting money in your country because in general with that crisis, you can also get a currency crisis. And what the foreign investors don't want to do is the moment they say, install a machine in your country, suddenly that machine, say in dollars, is worth much less because there was a crisis, there's a big depreciation. They cannot sell this machinery in the international market. They need to do something domestically. When they repatriate that money, it's going to be worth much less. So, and also, if you're prone to that crisis, demand for the product of whatever that machine is producing is going to be very volatile. So whatever calculation that you made before about the profitability of such an investment is going to go down. So again, the game that needs to be played is that is supposed to support development. To support development, it needs to be incurred in a way that doesn't increase your probability of having a crisis. And that decision needs to be made right at the beginning, in the process of deciding to borrow or not. What are the terms of this loan? Am I ready to go to the market and get just market rates, or I should stick to grants or to loans from multilateral organizations? That's going to depend on the terms of this loan. Someone mentioned here Chinese loans. If they are, but also mentioned that they may be very expensive. If the rates are reasonable, let's say below your current growth rates, you can look at an average of the last 5 years if you want to be conservative. And then you look at, I've grown, say, 5% a year on average. And this interest rate that I'm going to pay in real terms, so if you take out inflation out of the interest rate, is below that, chances are, if you don't get into a crisis, that's not such a bad deal. If it's much above your usual growth rate, you should be wary and not incur that indebtedness. Now, why transparency? It's a big deal. Transparency is a big deal, that transparency. Of course, for the population, because it's your obligation as public servant to make sure you tell your population why you're borrowing. Someone mentioned here, sometimes the people don't even know that building, that hospital was built out of some indebtedness. So this, of course, is important. But there's an economic reason why transparency is important as well. The more transparent you are, the better the creditor herself is going to know of your ability to repay the debt. Your terms are going to be better. Now, if you create a reputation for not being quite transparent, there is an uncertainty about your capacity to repay the debt. And the interest rate that you're going to incur is going to be higher because people don't quite know what you're holding. I think the biggest challenge that we face here as we help countries is how to make the transition from lack of transparency to transparency, in particular for countries that do have market debt. So I acknowledge that this transition can be complicated because in this process, things may come to the fore that basically lower the confidence, market confidence of your ability to repay the debt. So this process needs to be managed. The case of Congo that was just brought up, a case where you have low indebtedness and you want to create a credible commitment so you can get more financing. That's, again, the way you do it is by committing to good practices. So first you need to make sure you have a back office, so a debt management office that can manage well these liabilities. We are here to help, by the way, to put together that office. We can have a program of 1, 2, 3 years, as long as it takes, so that that office is in place, and then we can even go to the public and say, we did a good work here, look at this country. It has a good capacity to manage that. Then you need to be very transparent, say that's all our liabilities. So if you don't have as much liability, if you show that you have a good capacity to manage indebtedness, then you are putting yourself in a good position to then issue your first debt. Maybe your first debt should be issued to organizations that are willing to lend at a lower rate, like the World Bank or some development banks, because that's their mission. And then you show that you can manage that debt for a couple of years, then you may be ready to then issue that in the market. They can be quite healthy if you have the capacity to manage the liabilities. Let's see, there are other questions on but I've already mentioned the Chinese issue. I think it's a creditor like any other in many ways. If they're offering good terms, you should borrow from them. But this is the key thing. Are they offering good terms? And second, if you come to us and ask for our help, we need to have a view of the whole indebtedness that you have. So transparency to the World Bank and the IMF is quite important, so we can be more effective in helping. On fuel subsidies, like was discussed, the problem of subsidies is not that when say a World Bank or an IMF mission say you better undo the subsidies, it's not that we don't know that it's going to be hard on the people. It's just that we know that if you don't do something about the cost recovery of that particular service, say the provision of fuel, if you don't have some cost recovery, that service is going to be a perpetual drain in public resources and may create a debt crisis, because then you may try to fill that gap by borrowing in a more expensive way. So even though for that moment the population may be benefiting from the subsidies, that's not sustainable in the medium and long term, which is what we are talking about here, is a way that you can get sustainable long-term growth. So one way of doing, for instance, the subsidy would be, instead of having subsidies to everybody to consume, you just let prices be market prices, and then you transfer to the poor, target to the poor, resources so that help alleviate the weight of the cost of fuel in their budget. So that's maybe a better way of doing. And then the question is, do governments have the ability to actually identify who these poor are to be able to target? Maybe some don't. Maybe there's a lot of informality. There's not enough registry of people's income, which is also something that the World Bank can help developing. But I do think that a policy that letting market prices kind of speak for themselves and then target the benefits is quite good, because you're really helping whoever cannot pay for the fuel, and you're not subsidize the people who can, the wealthier. So let me stop here, and I don't know if you have further questions.
Actually, we have a few more, one from Estonia and one from the gentleman from Senegal. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
And we will need to keep these brief because we have only 10 minutes to not just conclude this session, but also some concluding remarks from the entire day. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree with the advice and transparency and wisdom in contracting the debt. Estonia has managed the transition with 8% gross debt to GDP, and net debt is basically zero. But my question is related to the outline what you shared, where it basically states that the risk of debt distress among the IDA countries is about 50% of those countries are at the risk of debt distress, which is the worst outcome since 1980s. So what is the explanation behind it? How we came out so badly over these past years? Thank you.
I just like to, share some light on Islamic banking. I was expecting for you to answer to these questions, but I worked for 27 years in the Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah. When I heard my brother saying that they're attractive now because they give money, they don't pay interest, which is true. It is true in loan. But you have many modes of financing in Islamic Development Bank. You have the leasing, you have the trade, you have the installment sale, you have the equity participation in the capital of company, and you have the loan. The loan is for social projects like education and health. And in this project, when you receive a loan, you don't pay interest. You don't pay interest because it is forbidden by Islam. By the other mode of financing, like a trade, for example, Senegal want to buy oil from Nigeria. The Islamic Development Bank is going to buy the petrol from Nigeria and sell it to Senegal. Instead of paying in the direct transaction between Senegal and Nigeria, 80%, in this case, Senegal would be paying 3%. At the same time, it enabled two member country of Islamic Development Bank to enter into relationship. And this is a tremendous, very attractive. In 2005, in Lima, during the annual meeting of the World Bank, there was a common seminar between the World Bank and the Islamic Development Bank, because the World Bank realized that they didn't know this kind of practice, and they learned to work together and to benefit from the experience of the Islamic Development Bank in the field of social project like health and education. Thank you.
Yes, 2 more questions, but please could you be very brief? Thank you.
Oui, merci. Je serai très bref.
I will be super brief. I have a question regarding the debt level for an emerging country or a developing country can bear. This is a question that gets discussed even for other countries. Is there a level of debt that should not be gone beyond, or can a country go on the markets and take debt at interesting rates and go beyond the threshold that has been decided, the 70%, 80%? Is my question clear? I'd like to have a reply as clear as possible from the IMF and the World Bank on this.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, moderator, and thank you, the presenter. I would just like to get the advice from the presenter on what MPs can do on the debt borrowing. If you look at the procedure, because the procedure sometimes looks as formality, because the final approval is given by the parliamentarian, while the signing of the contract has already passed a long time ago. Thank you.
I think we'll have to close it for the questions, unless you think you can have yours in 20 seconds.
My question is, what is the World Bank Group doing to help these countries that are indebted to help their economies?
Thank you. That was brief.
Thank you. So it started by the last question. First, we are helping them manage the liabilities. Again, like I said, we have ways depending on the level of income of the country. So if they can get either grants, so depending on the level of crisis, we can give a bit more of that type of grants. So I don't think that's really a huge deal, because very often when you're in a debt crisis, you need a lot of help. So it's not a little bit more money that's going to make a big difference. The big difference is helping conduct macroeconomic policy in a way that bring the country back from the crisis. So if a debt restructuring is needed, we have a specialty that can help restructure that. There are costs if you do that, because then, particularly if you borrow from the market, if you do a debt restructuring, there's going to be a little bit of a spot, and in your reputation, then you're going to pay higher premium for future when you borrow in the future. If you don't have access to the market, that's less of a big deal, but there's a whole process of doing that. And it's painful, because basically you owe money, you don't have resources to pay, and you need to do an adjustment. So I think the best of our work is trying to work with the countries to avoid that to happen. And then going to the question from Estonia, so why did 50% of countries in that sample are either in debt distress or at a high risk on debt distress? They are not in debt distress, but they are high risk. I think just what happened since 2008 has a lot to do with what happened to interest rates around the world. As the crisis in developed economies went full force, a bunch of central bankers just reduced interest rates significantly. Well, in the US, hit 0%, now it's at about 2%, but in other countries went even negative. So that created an incentive for a lot of countries that have access to the market to borrow, because they are looking, look, interest rates are very low, and I have all these development needs, and there's a logic why it makes sense borrowing, because if I have a scarcity of capital, the returns to this investment must be much higher than what I'm paying in this low interest rate environment. Well, it happened that a lot of these investments were just not very good. So you end up with the debt, even at a lower interest rate, you still have to pay the debt, and still there's some interest rate attached to it. And some of the investments were not very good, so you raise your debt to GDP ratios. So what we see happening is a lot of the increase in this indebtedness was market debt. There was also an increase in what we would call non-Paris Club debt. It's true, sometimes the terms of this debt is not quite transparent to us, or even the amount sometimes. So that's something that we are working with countries to make sure that that is transparent. So I think there was a lot of incentive to get more debt. And I'm not convinced, or actually what we see in the data is that the proceeds of that indebtedness were not as well invested as they should have been. On Islamic Bank, I think again, we learned a lot by interacting with countries. All the alternatives that you mentioned seem reasonable to me today here. The details matter because, I mean, there's this saying among economists, there is no free lunch. So, I mean, if there is a very interesting financial arrangement that really makes two countries benefit and they don't have to go to the market, by all means, I mean, I think we are very open to all of those issues. What can MPs do about indebtedness? Well, I mean, there was a question about the niveau d'endettement. I think here depends a lot on country situation. Economists have done research on that, and there is this 60% level above which emerging markets, so not low-income countries, emerging markets shouldn't pass. Maybe low-income countries say 40, 50%. These are rule of thumbs, 40, 50% of GDP. I think the important thing is, if you look at a debt that is not sustainable, you know it. I mean, like if you're in the market, I worked for many years in a hedge fund, you look at, and you know it's not going to go well. So for some countries, that level can be 30%, for some can be 60%. It's going to depend on the realities of the country. Is this country going into a civil war or something like that? If it has 30% debt to GDP ratio, it's very worrisome. If the country is stable and debt is stable at 40, 50%, and actually maybe even declining a little bit because the country is growing a lot, is a different situation. But passing way beyond 50% for countries that are less developed, I find very risky, because then that has a way to kind of feed itself. What can MPs do about indebtedness? Rules. Countries need to have very clear fiscal rules, and the role of Parliament is to make sure the governments abide by them. So to be in a situation that you have to rubber stamp a decision that was done in a context that they have no rules for what's really directing indebtedness is a bad institutional arrangement. So the rules need to be very clear. Parliament is the eyes of the people on what government is doing, and they should do their jobs, make sure that the rules abide by. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of these insightful answers and for your initial presentations to both of the speakers, as well as to the excellent questions. I'm sorry, but we will really have to close it because we're already out of time. We need to, you want a short comment? You're insisting? Okay, I think I'm too tolerant, but go ahead.
Actually, just a question for the World Bank, which being in the financial committee of my country in the Parliament of Jordan, I would like to emphasize on one thing, is that even though the World Bank tries to support any country with loans, I still think that it should be focused on where is this loan being used or utilized. Jordan has maybe borrowed in the last few months the biggest loan or the second biggest loan given by the World Bank, which is almost 1.6 billion. And I think that whenever you support a country with more loans, it has two values. Although you support their currency or their power to pay for their liabilities, but also it sinks more into more debt, which is very dangerous. I guess that the World Bank should also focus with the country. Where is this money being utilized, and there should always be a 20% at least of any loan given to any country to be used for more investment and for more prosperous activities for the country, so that the loan can be fruitful. Thank you very much.
I agree with you. That's quite important, but that's the way the loans are done. I mean, like when we lend to a country, there is a program that is supporting that decision to lend. So there is what we call prior actions that the governments commit to doing it. And in general, that's in some countries can be a quite long process, sometimes takes several years to get in agreement what are these key actions that they should do before they can borrow. And those actions are very country-specific. So it could be, for instance, a program to improve the functioning of the energy sector, for instance. Or could be maybe for this other country, the key is improve education achievements, which is also, human capital, so it's good for the long term. So all this already kind of, sometimes you don't say exactly how you're going to spend these prior actions, but they give the tone of the relationship with the World Bank. And so that's completely part of the discussion. Now, after it's disbursed, we have offices in several of our client countries, most of them. And that relationship continues. And the idea is that we are there exactly to help countries manage how to invest those resources. But let's just also make clear that ultimately, I'm going to say something so obvious that I feel, ultimately, the responsibility or indebtedness, how to use, is of the countries themselves. So we are there to help. But ownership is a key word here. I mean, like, it doesn't make any sense for us to play the role of either police or I mean, the idea is to help countries achieve their own objectives. And that's how IMF and World Bank loans are given, in an agreement with the government, in a program that is owned by the governments with our support.
So once again, thank you to the speakers and to all of you for the questions. I've been asked to make a few concluding remarks, but let me first start by thanking the World Bank and the IMF team, and especially the team that is working with us parliamentarians for this great organizing event, for bringing us together to discuss these important topics. So especially let me thank Naye, Blythe, Georgiana, as well as Paulina, and I hope I didn't forget anyone, for your excellent work, as always, and for putting together an outstanding program that, as you could see, not just kept the interest of the parliamentarians, but it was hard to stop them from asking questions within the proper time. But I will make just a few general conclusions from the topics that we've discussed during the day, focusing on what can we do as parliamentarians once we go back home on the issues that are quite important. Conclusion number one, parliamentarians can play a key role in developing inclusive growth agendas by designing and implementing policy in their home countries that support this agenda, as well as by supporting IMF and World Bank programs that allocate resources to fight inequalities. Secondly, parliaments can increase their role through parliamentary cooperation and diplomacy by bringing countries together in trade cooperation, which can become an engine of growth and job creation. Thirdly, parliaments can build and sustain spending in human capital in a changing world by taking into account technological innovations, as well as play a key role through parliamentary oversight to fiscal policy, as well as managing debt in ways that fight inequality. And a final thing, knowing how economic or lack of economic growth can actually lead to instability, and this is best known by low-income countries. Perhaps just an appeal to the countries that are financing IDA to continue to do so, because by doing so, they are not only supporting these countries, the low-income countries individually, but they are supporting inclusive growth as well as peace and stability globally, which is an aim that every single country, every single peace-loving country has, and they have contributed to that by supporting especially the low-income countries so far, which I'm sure the appreciation has been heard today during the day by us as representatives of those countries, but also those that are not here today. So these are very general conclusions, and I hope you all agree with them. If not, please let me know. With that, let me thank you once again, all of you, for coming all over from your countries, from different continents, and for really making these discussions really rich. And I hope to see you soon, either in your home countries or in the spring meetings, which will take place in April. Thank you so much once again.
Also,
the greatest team.
For her, for the very talented way she ran the two last sessions of our session.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Great seeing you all. Thank you to the speakers once again.